The old man didn't even wait until they reached the front porch. Harold Thornton grabbed Mabel's arm the moment the funeral wagon rolled to a stop, his fingers digging in hard enough that she'd feel it for days, and he shoved a folded paper into her chest like he was serving a court summons. "You're out by morning," he said. Not whispered, not regretted. Said. Mabel was still wearing her black dress. The cemetery dirt was still on her boots. Her daughter Elsie stood 3 feet away, holding a rag doll and staring at her grandfather with the kind of silent confusion that only 8-year-olds can manage. The look that says, "I don't understand what's happening, but I know it's wrong." Harold didn't even glance at the child. "By morning," he said again. Then he walked inside and shut the door. If you've ever stood in front of a closed door that used to be yours, you already know what Mabel felt. And if you haven't, stay with me. Because what this woman did next will change the way you think about strength forever. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen road and to the woman nobody believed in. The ground had been frozen solid for 2 weeks before they buried Daniel Thornton, and the gravediggers had complained about it loud enough that Mabel heard them from across the cemetery. She hadn't cried then. She'd been too busy watching Harold, her father-in-law, the man who'd run the Thornton Ranch for 40 years with the kind of authority that made lesser men look at their shoes, standing at the head of the grave like he was presiding over a business transaction rather than his own son's funeral. She'd thought, watching him, he's already calculating. She hadn't known how fast. The Thornton Ranch sat on 1,200 acres of Montana mountain country, the kind of land that looks like a painting until you have to work it, and then it just looks like punishment. Daniel had been the second son, which meant he'd spent his whole adult life trying to earn something his older brother Raymond got by simply being born first. The main house went to Raymond. The foreman's cabin at the edge of the tree line went to Daniel when he married Mabel 6 years back, and Harold had made sure everyone understood it was a gift, not an inheritance. And gifts, Harold liked to remind people, could be taken back. Mabel had never trusted that man. But Daniel had loved his father the way some people love a wound, unable to stop pressing it, hoping one day it would feel different. It never did. She'd met Daniel at a church social in Billings when she was 22 years old and still believed that people showed you who they were gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. By the time you got a clear picture, she figured, you'd already decided whether you wanted to stay. Daniel was handsome in a weather-beaten way, funny when he wasn't trying too hard, and he'd looked at her. Really looked at her, not past her or around her the way so many men did when they clocked her size. Like she was someone worth seeing. That had been enough. For a long time, that had been more than enough. But 6 years of marriage on Harold Thornton's land meant 6 years of borrowed permission. Every decision, whether to plant a kitchen garden, whether to fix the cabin roof before winter, whether Elsie could have a barn cat, ran through Harold first. Daniel always said he'd talk to his father about it. He rarely did. And when he did, the answer was usually no, delivered through a long silence that Daniel would translate afterward as, he didn't say he was against it exactly. Mabel had bitten down on so many responses over so many years that she figured she'd worn her back teeth smooth by now. When Daniel got sick in October, it happened fast the way those things sometimes do. A cough that didn't clear, a fever that wouldn't break. A man who'd been capable of throwing hay bales at 30, becoming unable to lift a water cup at 34. Mabel had nursed him herself, through the nights and through the days when Elsie was at the schoolhouse 2 miles down the road. She'd slept maybe 4 hours out of every 24 for 6 weeks. She'd made broths from whatever she could trap or coax from Harold's kitchen stores, which he'd measured out to her like he was doing her a personal favor each time. Daniel died on a Tuesday, cold morning. Elsie had been at school, and Mabel was grateful for that. She'd had an hour alone with the grief before she had to become someone's mother again. She'd sat beside him for that hour and held his hand and didn't say anything, because everything she might have said was either too late or too true, and neither seemed right for the occasion. Then she'd gotten up, washed her face, walked to the schoolhouse herself to collect Elsie before anyone else could tell the child first. That was the last quiet hour Mabel Thornton would have for a very long time. The funeral was 3 days later. Harold had arranged everything: the preacher, the hymns, the casseroles that neighboring ranch women brought and stacked on the main house table. He'd also arranged, without telling Mabel, for a lawyer from Billings to be present at the house when the mourners dispersed. She found that out when Raymond's wife, a thin-lipped woman named Constance, who'd never once used Mabel's first name, pulled her aside after the graveside service and said, in a voice like she was discussing weather, "Harold wants everyone inside. There's some paperwork." "What kind of paperwork?" Mabel said. It wasn't really a question. Constance looked somewhere past Mabel's left ear. "The legal kind." The lawyer's name was Harding. He was maybe 50, had the careful face of a man accustomed to rooms full of people who didn't want to hear what he was saying, and he read from papers that established, in the language of the territory of Montana, that the foreman's cabin and all property within the bounds of the Thornton Ranch reverted to Harold Thornton upon the death of Daniel James Thornton, with no claim of right by surviving spouse. Mabel had heard Harold's voice in every syllable of that document. She sat very still while Harding read. Elsie was beside her, close enough that Mabel could feel the warmth of the child's arm against her own, and she kept her face flat and her hands folded in her lap and breathed through her nose the way she'd learned to do in rooms where showing anything would only give Harold something to use. When Harding finished, Harold looked at her for the first time all day. "You'll need to arrange your things," he said. "I'll give you until morning." Someone in the room, she never saw who, made a small sound of discomfort. Raymond said nothing. Constance looked at her hands. "You're putting us out," Mabel said. "Today." "Tomorrow morning," Harold said, as though the 12 hours were a kindness she should be grateful for. "You're welcome to take what's yours. The furniture stays." The furniture. She and Daniel had built that furniture together. The table, the 2 chairs, the child's bed frame with the carved rabbit on the headboard that Daniel had worked on for 3 evenings straight because Elsie had asked for it. Harold wanted to keep a child's bed frame with a rabbit carved into it. She didn't say any of that. She looked at Harold Thornton's face, the face of a man who had watched his son die and was now looking at his son's widow and calculating what the square footage of the foreman's cabin was worth in board feet, and she understood something she'd only half known before. This man had never seen her as a person. Not once. Not in 6 years. She was a liability that Daniel had brought onto the property. And now Daniel was gone. "All right," she said. Harold blinked. He'd been expecting something. Argument, tears, pleading, some form of scene he could dismiss or use. He hadn't expected all right. "All right," Mabel said again, and stood and took Elsie's hand. She walked out of that room and didn't look back. Outside in the frozen air, Elsie squeezed her fingers and said quietly, "Mama, where are we going to go?" Mabel didn't answer right away. She was looking at the mountains. The sky above the tree line was the color of an old bruise, that particular blue-gray that means real cold is coming, the kind that doesn't apologize. She thought about the town of Crabtree, 9 miles down the mountain road. There was a boarding house there run by a woman named Mrs. Potts, who rented rooms to widows and minors and anyone else without better options. Mabel had been inside it once, 3 years back. It had smelled like boiled cabbage and old wool and something she couldn't name, but recognized as the smell of people who'd stopped expecting anything different. She had $31 saved. She'd hidden it, over years, in the lining of an old winter coat, $1 here, $2 there, money she'd managed to keep from household accounting without Daniel noticing or asking. She wasn't proud of the hiding, but she wasn't ashamed of it either. She'd known, the way women of her time and circumstances learned to know things without being told, that a day might come when she needed something that was only hers. $31. 2 weeks at Mrs. Potts if she didn't eat much. After that, nothing. She'd need work. In winter. In a town where she knew no one well enough to ask a favor from. With an 8-year-old who needed meals and warmth and some kind of continuity in a life that had just been carved out from under her. She stood there in the cold and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic didn't work. "Mama," Elsie said again. "I'm thinking," Mabel said. She looked at the road to town. She looked at the tree line. She thought about Mrs. Potts's boarding house and what $31 bought and what it didn't buy and who she would be at the end of it. Smaller, probably. More dependent. More of what Harold Thornton had already decided she was. Then she thought about the forest. It was a thought so unreasonable that she almost dismissed it before it finished forming. The mountains were no place for a woman and child in December. Everybody knew that. Everybody had always told her what everybody knew, and for most of her life she had believed them because she was a woman of her size and time, which meant the world had spent considerable energy in forming her what she was and wasn't capable of. She'd trapped rabbits since she was 14. Her own father had taught her, not because he'd expected her to need it, but because he'd believed in being useful, and he'd passed that on to her the way other fathers passed on their faces or their names. She knew how to read the sky, how to find water under ice, how to identify which wood burned long and which burned fast. She knew things she'd never been asked to demonstrate because nobody had ever thought to ask. She stood there and she thought, what do I actually know how to do? And then she thought, what would I do if I believed myself? The handcart was behind the cabin, an old two-wheeled thing she'd used for hauling from the kitchen garden. She spent the rest of the afternoon packing it, while Elsie sat on the porch steps and watched with the particular silence of a child who understands the situation is serious and has decided that questions would make things harder. Mabel packed the wool blankets, the cooking pot and the cast-iron pan, rope, the small axe Daniel had kept sharp, a tin of matches, kept dry in a cloth wrap, her father's skinning knife, which she'd carried everywhere since he died and which had no monetary value in every other kind. Food, what little there was of it, mostly dried beans and some smoked meat she'd put up herself in October. The warm coats. Elsie's rag doll, tucked in last, on top. She didn't pack the things that were too heavy to be worth it. She didn't pack sentiment. She packed what would help her live. Harold came out once, stood in the doorway of the main house, watched her load the cart without offering help or comment. She felt his eyes on her back and she did not turn around. When she was done, she brought the cart around to the front and Elsie climbed down from the steps and stood beside it, looking up at Mabel with an expression that was trying very hard to be brave and almost making it. "We're not going to town, are we?" Elsie said. "No." "Where are we going?" Mabel put her hand on the cart handle. The mountain road ran south toward Crabtree. The old logging trail ran north into the trees. She had no business going north. She had every reason to go south and accept what south offered and become who south would make her. "Into the forest," she said. Elsie stared at her. "For how long?" Mabel looked at the sky again. That cold, bruised blue. She thought about spring, thought about what 4 months in Mrs. Potts' boarding house would cost her, in money and in something harder to name. "Until spring," she said. Elsie was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up one side of the cart handle, her small hands barely wrapping around it, and stood there waiting. "Okay," her daughter said. "Then let's go." Mabel almost laughed, didn't. Looked at this 8-year-old girl who had buried her father that morning and was standing in the cold holding a cart handle and saying, "Okay, let's go," and felt something shift in her chest, something that wasn't grief exactly and wasn't courage exactly, but was the combination of the two that sometimes makes people do the impossible. They pushed the cart north. She didn't look back at the Thornton Ranch. She didn't look back at the grave, or the road, or the warm yellow light spilling from the main house windows where Harold was no doubt already talking to Raymond about what to do with the foreman's cabin now that the liability had been removed. She looked at the trees. They closed in around her and Elsie like a door swinging shut, quiet and permanent and indifferent in the way that wilderness is always indifferent. Not cruel exactly, just utterly uninterested in what you wanted or who you thought you were. The cold was immediate. It pressed in from all sides, found the gaps in her coat, reached for Elsie's ears under her wool hat. The cartwheels caught on frozen ruts, and she had to wrench them free twice in the first quarter mile. Her arms ached. Her feet were already numb at the toes. She kept walking. She didn't know what she was looking for, not exactly. She knew she needed shelter, real shelter, not a lean-to that would fail in the first serious wind. And she knew that in logged-over mountain country, if you looked long enough, you sometimes found the trees that the loggers had passed over. The ancient ones. The ones too big, or too twisted, or too damaged to be worth taking. The trees that had survived everything. The light was failing by the time she found it. She almost walked past it. She was tired and her shoulders were burning, and Elsie had stopped talking half an hour back, which was how Mabel knew the child was genuinely cold, because Elsie talked when she was nervous, and went quiet when she was something worse than nervous. Then she saw it. The cedar was enormous in the way that things are enormous when your brain refuses to fully process the scale at first. The way some buildings look small until you're standing next to them, and suddenly you understand. It rose maybe 80 feet, possibly more, and the trunk was massive, scarred on one side by what must have been a lightning strike years ago, maybe decades. The strike had done something strange and particular to that side of the tree, had carved into the heartwood, had burned and healed and burned again over seasons until there was a vertical wound in the trunk, roughly the width of a doorframe, that opened into darkness. Mabel stood in front of it with this cart and stared. She put her hand against the cedar bark. It was rough and cold, but underneath the cold there was, she wasn't imagining it, a faint, resinous warmth. The smell of the wood, still alive, still generating whatever small heat living things generate, drifting up through the damage. She took her lantern from the cart and lit it with hands that barely worked, and she leaned through the gap in the wood. The interior was larger than any reasonable person could have hoped for. The hollow went up maybe 12 feet before narrowing, and the floor of it, the actual floor, was maybe 5 feet across at the widest, 8 feet deep, dry, insulated by centuries of bark and heartwood on every side. Above, the narrowing created a natural flue. She could see it, the channel going up through the living tree, the same channel the lightning had opened. A chimney. The tree had its own chimney. She stood there with her lantern and looked at this impossible thing, and her mind, the practical, methodical, stubbornly unsentimental mind that had gotten her this far, started doing what it always did when presented with a problem. It started solving. "Mama said," Elsie said from behind her. "What is it?" Mabel stepped back out, turned, and saw her daughter standing in the last of the gray light, her face pinched with cold, the rag doll tucked under one arm. "It's our house," Mabel said. Elsie looked at the tree, looked at her mother, looked at the tree again. "That's a tree," Elsie said. "I know what it is," Mabel said. "Come look." She lifted Elsie and held her while the girl peered into the hollow with the lantern light spilling yellow across the interior walls, and she felt her daughter's small body go still with the particular stillness of a child whose mind is working something out. "It's big," Elsie said finally. "Big enough. Is it safe?" Mabel thought about Harold Thornton's face, thought about the road to Crabtree, thought about what safe had looked like for the last 6 years. Borrowed shelter on borrowed land, permission for every choice, $31 in a coat lining, and the slow erosion of believing yourself capable of anything. Safer than the alternative, she said. She set Elsie down and turned back to the cart, and she started unpacking. The wind came down off the mountain hard that night, the kind of wind that sounds like it's looking for something to break. Mabel worked by lantern light for 3 hours after Elsie fell asleep. The child curled in blankets just inside the cedar's gap, already warming in the insulated space, while Mabel wedged branches into the opening's lower half to block the draft. Her hands cracked at the knuckles. She didn't stop. Her shoulders stopped aching at some point, which she knew meant they'd gone past aching into something she'd feel worse tomorrow. She didn't stop. She looked at that hollow cedar and she thought about every person who'd ever looked at her and calculated what she wasn't capable of. And she thought about Harold Thornton handing her papers on the day she buried her husband. And she thought about Elsie saying, "Okay, let's go," with her small cold hands on the cart handle. She kept working. By the time the lantern began to gutter, she'd created something that wasn't quite shelter yet, but held the promise of it. The gap was partially sealed. A small fire burned inside the hollow, its smoke rising up through the tree's natural channel and dispersing above the canopy. The air inside was warmer than the air outside by a margin that was, for tonight, the difference between manageable and dangerous. She sat down beside Elsie's sleeping form, her back against ancient cedar, and she felt the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the living wood and the warmth of her daughter pressed against her side. Outside, the wind found nothing to take from her. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes and breathed and did not let herself think about tomorrow. Tomorrow was its own war. Tonight, they were warm. Tonight, they were whole. Tonight, that was enough. She woke up before dawn with her face cold and her back on fire. The fire inside the hollow had burned down to coals sometime in the night, and the temperature had dropped enough that her breath came out in small, visible clouds, rising and disappearing in the dark air above her. Elsie was pressed against her side, still asleep, her small face tucked into the crook of Mabel's arm with the absolute boneless trust of a child who has decided that wherever her mother is, that's where safe is. Mabel lay still for a moment and did not move. She was cataloging. That was what she did when the situation was bad. She went quiet inside her own head and made a list of what was true, what she had, what she didn't have, what needed doing first. What was true? They had survived the night. The coals were still live. The hollow had held its warmth better than she'd had any right to expect, the ancient cedar wood acting like insulation around them, the sealed gap holding out most of the wind. The blankets were damp from condensation but not soaked. Elsie's hands, when Mabel checked them without waking her, were cold but not dangerously so. What she had, the small axe, the rope, the cast iron pan and the cooking pot, dried beans, smoked meat, 4 apples she'd grabbed from the root cellar at the last minute, the tin of matches, still dry, her father's knife, $31 in the coat lining, which was useless out here but which she kept anyway because some things you hold on to past the point of reason, the lantern, nearly out of oil. What she didn't have, enough food for more than 2 weeks, a real door, any way to make the floor of the hollow less than frozen ground, clay to seal the gaps properly, a second axe handle because the one on Daniel's axe had a hairline crack she'd noticed yesterday and been trying not to think about. What needed doing first? More wood, always more wood. The cold was the enemy and the fire was the only answer, and the fire ate wood the way grief ate time, constantly, without pause, without gratitude. She eased out from under Elsie without waking her, pulled the blanket up around the child's shoulders, and crawled through the gap into the outside air. The cold hit her like a wall. Not aggressive, exactly. More like indifferent. The mountain didn't care that she was out here. That was the thing she kept having to reckon with. The wilderness was not against her. It was simply not for her, and she had to make it something she could survive inside of, the way you survive a marriage that isn't cruel but isn't warm, by building your own warmth from whatever materials you can find. She picked up the axe and went to work. The trees around the cedar were a mix of deadfall and living pine, and she went for the deadfall first. The ones already down, already dry enough to burn, without filling the hollow with smoke. She wasn't strong in the way that Harold Thornton's ranch hands were strong, the big swinging, impressive strength of men who'd spent years throwing bales. Her strength was different. It was the kind that doesn't advertise itself. The kind built from years of doing things nobody was watching, hauling water, kneading bread, lifting and carrying in 100 small daily repetitions that added up, over time, to a body that knew how to work. She split wood for an hour before her shoulders told her to stop. She didn't stop. She split for another 30 minutes and then she stopped, because the axe handle had developed a new complaint, and she couldn't afford to lose it completely. She stacked what she had and looked at it. Not enough. Not close to enough. But a start. When she crawled back through the gap, Elsie was awake, sitting up in the blankets with the rag doll in her lap, and her dark hair flattened on one side from sleep. She looked at Mabel the way children look at their parents when they're frightened and trying not to show it. Too steady, too careful, doing the work of seeming fine. "I'm hungry," Elsie said. "I know. Give me 10 minutes. She built the fire back up with the new wood and set the cooking pot over it with water she'd melted from snow. She'd packed snow into the pot before coming back in, another thing she knew to do from her father's teaching, and she added a handful of dried beans and a piece of the smoked meat, and she sat beside the fire and waited. Elsie watched the pot. "How long are beans?" she asked. "Too long for breakfast. This is for later." Mabel pulled one of the apples from the pack. "This is for now." She cut it in half with her father's knife, gave the larger half to Elsie without comment. The child didn't argue about the sizes, which was its own small heartbreak. Elsie had already understood, in the way children understand things they shouldn't have to, that the portions were going to be important now. They sat together in the firelight and ate apple in silence. "Is it going to get colder?" Elsie asked. "Probably." "How much colder?" Mabel looked at her daughter over the half apple. "Montana winter cold. You know what that means." "Bad." "Yes." Elsie chewed thoughtfully. "Are we going to be okay?" This was the question Mabel had been waiting for. She'd been waiting for it since yesterday afternoon, since the moment she'd turned the cart north instead of south, since the moment she'd set into the forest and watched her 8-year-old daughter decide to believe her. She could have said yes automatically. That was what mothers were supposed to do: provide the reassurance, smooth the fear, keep the child's anxiety from becoming a weight she had to carry on top of everything else. Mabel had been given that kind of reassurance herself, as a child, and she'd noticed something about it. It worked in the moment, and then it wore off. And when it wore off, you were left with the original fear plus the knowledge that the reassurance had been empty. "I don't know for certain," she said. "I think we are. But I don't know for certain." Elsie looked at her. Then she nodded once, the way people nod when they've been told a hard thing they already suspected and have decided they can handle it. "Okay," she said. "What do we do first?" Mabel almost told her to just stay warm and stay out of the way. That was the practical answer. The child was 8, and 8-year-olds were more liability than asset in a survival situation. And the most helpful thing Elsie could do was conserve heat and not require rescuing. But she looked at her daughter's face, that too careful steadiness, the effort it was costing the girl to hold herself together, and she understood that what Elsie needed was not to be kept out of it. What she needed was to be part of it, to have a role, to feel that her presence here was something other than a problem her mother was managing around. "You're going to help me find Clay," Mabel said. Elsie's expression shifted, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. "What does Clay look like?" "Gray-brown. Comes up in chunks near the creek bank. It'll be frozen, so we'll have to chip it free. Your hands are smaller than mine, which will actually help." This was partly true and partly invented in the moment, but Elsie didn't need to know the difference. The point was that her small hands had a purpose. "When do we start?" Elsie asked. "After the beans," Mabel said. They found the creek half a mile from the cedar, following the sound of it under the ice. That particular low, hollow musical sound of moving water trapped below a frozen surface, audible if you stopped and listened and knew what you were listening for. The bank was steep, and Mabel went down first and then helped Elsie, holding her by the wrist while the child picked her way down the icy slope with the focused concentration of someone who has decided that falling would be embarrassing. She didn't fall. The clay was exactly where Mabel had expected it, exposed on the cut bank where the creek curved, frozen solid, but accessible if you chipped at it. She took her father's knife and a flat stone she'd carried down from above, and she worked at the clay while Elsie used a stick to pry at the looser chunks near the edges. They worked for 2 hours. It was miserable work. The cold came up from the frozen ground through their boots, and Mabel's fingers lost sensation in the first 30 minutes, and she worked by feel and by knowledge after that, which was not comfortable but was workable. Elsie complained 3 times, once about her fingers, once about her knees, once about the fact that clay was disgusting, and each time Mabel said, "I know," without stopping, and each time Elsie went back to work after about 30 seconds of waiting for more sympathy than that. They came back with the cooking pot packed full of clay chunks, and their coats streaked with gray-brown mud and expressions that could only be described as hard-won satisfaction. The sealing took another afternoon. Mabel worked the clay with her hands over the fire until it was pliable, and then she pressed it into the gaps in the cedar opening, the places where wind came through, where cold air found the seams between branches she'd woven into the lower opening. The cedar bark itself sealed surprisingly well where it overlapped, but the woven branch sections had gaps she hadn't been able to address with just branches. The clay filled them. Not perfectly. It would crack as it dried and she'd have to go back over it, but well enough that when she sat inside the hollow that evening with the fire burning, she could feel the difference. The hollow was warmer, measurably, noticeably warmer. Elsie pressed her palm against the sealed wall and then looked at Mabel with an expression that was still cautious but no longer afraid in the same way. "It works," she said. "So far," Mabel said. She didn't let herself feel too much about that. She'd learned over the years to be careful with relief, to let herself feel it in small doses, enough to keep going, but not so much that it made you stupid about the next problem. The next problem was always there. In this case, the next problems were, in approximate order of urgency, the floor, which was still frozen ground, and which needed to be addressed before the cold became truly serious. The food supply, which needed to be stretched or supplemented. The wood supply, which needed to be constant. And the axe handle, which she was now treating with the same anxious care she'd once given to the hairline cracks in their relationship with Harold, monitoring it, working around it, knowing it was only a matter of time before something gave. She fixed the floor over the next 3 days. It was Elsie who gave her the idea, in the unintentional way children give you ideas. Not by suggesting them, but by doing something that makes you see something you should have already seen. On the second morning, Elsie had dragged a pile of dried pine needles and fallen leaves she'd found under a sheltered overhang of rock nearby, intending to make a softer sleeping spot, and had built herself a small nest of it against the cedar wall. Mabel looked at that nest and thought, insulation. She spent the better part of a day hauling dried material, needles, leaves, dry moss she found on the north faces of rocks, dry grass from under a stand of trees where the snow hadn't penetrated deeply. She layered it 6 inches deep across the floor of the hollow and then laid a flat stone she found near the creek on top of it near the fire, letting the stone heat through the day so it would release warmth through the night. It wasn't a bed, but it was not frozen ground, and the distinction mattered enormously when you were sleeping in it. Elsie tested it immediately, lying down and making an exaggerated assessment. Better, she announced, with the authority of a building inspector who'd seen worse. Don't roll around in it, Mabel said. You'll mess up the layering. I know that, Elsie said, in the tone of someone who had not in fact known that until 30 seconds ago. The trapping started on the 4th day. Mabel knew how to set snares. Her father had taught her with the same patient, unsentimental thoroughness that he'd taught her everything practical, as though the knowledge itself was the gift, and whether she ever needed it was secondary. She built 3 snares from rope she cut into lengths, set them on the rabbit runs she found by following the tracks in the snow. The small punched ovals of hind feet, the paired drag marks of front feet between them, the patterns as readable to her as sentences. The first snare caught a rabbit on the morning of the 5th day. She found it just after sunrise, and she stood there looking at it for a moment with a feeling she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph. Not guilt either, exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of having been right about yourself in a way you'd hoped for but hadn't been sure of. She brought it back to the hollow and cleaned it outside, working quickly in the cold, saving the skin because rabbit skin was not nothing when you were thinking about warmth. She stretched it on a flat piece of bark and hung it near enough to the fire to dry without scorching. What's that for? Elsie asked, watching from the gap. Eventually enough of them make a pair of mittens. Elsie looked at the skin, looked at her current mittens, which were wool and functional but not exceptional. How many is enough? 8, 10, depends on the size. That's a lot of rabbits. It's a long winter, Mabel said. She made stew that evening, the rabbit, some of the remaining dried beans, water, and a small amount of the smoked meat for flavor. She let it go slow over the fire, longer than necessary, because slow heat meant the smell filled the hollow, and the smell of something cooking had its own warming effect on the spirit that she couldn't afford to dismiss. Elsie ate her portion without comment until the bowl was empty, which was the highest compliment the child offered about food. Can I have more? She asked. Tomorrow, Mabel said. Elsie put the bowl down and didn't argue. And that small, quiet acceptance, that 8-year-old deciding not to push, deciding to trust the allocation, hit Mabel somewhere behind the sternum in a way the cold hadn't managed to reach. She turned toward the fire so Elsie wouldn't see her face. She thought about Daniel. She did this sometimes still, in the evenings, when the work stopped being enough to fill the mind completely. She thought about him not with the idealized grief of someone who'd lost a perfect thing, but with the complicated grief of someone who'd lost a real one. Daniel had been funny. He'd been kind in the specific physical ways that matter. The way he'd always put more wood on the fire before she asked. The way he'd lift Elsie without being asked when the child was tired. He'd also been weak in the specific ways that cost people things over time. His inability to stand in front of his father and say, no, this is wrong. His habit of translating Harold's silences into permission because permission was easier than confrontation. She didn't hate him for it. She'd spent a lot of time trying to decide if she should, and she'd concluded that she didn't, which was not the same as saying it hadn't cost her. She missed him. That was the simple version of it. She missed having someone to talk to in the dark, and she missed being looked at the way he'd looked at her in the beginning, and she was very tired of doing everything alone. She also knew, sitting in a hollow cedar that she had sealed and warmed and made livable through 8 days of relentless work, that she was more capable of doing everything alone than she had understood herself to be. Both things were true. She was getting better at letting them both be true at the same time. The axe handle broke on the 11th day. Not dramatically. It didn't shatter mid-swing. It gave out in stages, the crack she'd been monitoring widening over 3 days of careful use until it finally separated near the head on a cold gray morning when she was splitting a medium log and the handle just came apart in her hands, sending her stumbling sideways into the snow. She sat in the snow with the axe head in one hand and the broken handle in the other, and she felt, for the first time in 11 days, the specific weight of what it meant to be here alone. Without the axe, she couldn't split the larger pieces of deadfall efficiently. She could manage the smaller branches, but the bigger wood, the wood that burned long and made the difference between maintaining warmth and losing it, required more than her hands could manage with just the knife. She sat in the snow and let herself feel it for exactly 2 minutes. The cold, the fatigue, the size of what she was attempting, and the fragility of the tools she had to attempt it with. She let herself feel all of that completely, in the way she'd learned you had to, because if you didn't feel it all the way, it didn't go away. It just went underground and came back later when you were less prepared for it. 2 minutes. Then she stood up. She needed a new handle. The forest had ash trees. She'd seen them, identified them 3 days in because knowing your trees had been the first lesson her father taught, and she'd never unlearned it. Ash was what you wanted for tool handles, dense, fibrous, resistant to impact stress. She knew she needed a straight-grained piece, dry enough to work, but not so dry it'd be brittle. She found what she needed inside a fallen ash that had come down recent enough that the interior was still protected from moisture, the wood still workable. She spent the rest of that day shaping the handle with her father's knife, working the grain down to the rough shape, fitting the eye, tightening the join with wedges she cut from harder scraps. It took until dark. Her hands were bleeding from 3 separate cuts she'd taken while the knife slipped in numb fingers, and the new handle was not beautiful. It was rough and slightly too thick at the grip, and one side was flatter than the other because she'd overcut and had to compensate. But when she tested it on a log the next morning, it held. "You made that?" Elsie asked, crouching beside her and examining the repair with serious attention. "Mostly. It looks different than before." "It is different than before." Elsie picked up the axe by the handle and held it, testing the weight with the careful seriousness of someone doing a quality check. "It feels okay," she decided. "I'm glad you approve," Mabel said dryly. Elsie set it down and looked at her mother with an expression that had been developing over the past week, something between admiration and the dawning, complicated realization that the person you've depended on entirely is someone you're now seeing, possibly for the first time, as a full human being. "You can fix anything," Elsie said. It wasn't exactly a compliment, it was more like a discovery. "I can't fix everything," Mabel said. "I can fix enough." She thought about Harold Thornton sometimes, not obsessively, not with the consuming bitterness that she'd been afraid would take root in her if she let it. She'd watched bitterness work its way through people before, and she had no interest in what it did to them over time. But she thought about him, thought about the way he'd handed her those papers, the calculation in his face, the complete absence of anything that might have been called conscience. She thought about what he must believe right now, that she'd gone to Crabtree, that she was in Mrs. Potts' boarding house, eating into her small savings, humbled and diminished, and becoming daily more of what he'd always taken her for. A burden that had been passed to someone else's accounting. She didn't correct this. She let him think it, wherever he was. It cost her nothing, and it gave her something. A private knowledge, a truth about herself that existed entirely outside his evaluation of her, that he had no access to and no power over. She was still here. She was warm. She was feeding her child. He didn't know that, and she discovered she preferred it that way. By the end of the 3rd week, the hollow cedar had become something she could only call, without exaggeration, a home. Not comfortable in the way that the foreman's cabin had been comfortable. She wasn't pretending it was that, but organized, functional, known in the way that a space becomes known when you've spent enough hours working in it that your hands move through it without thinking. She'd built a shelf from flat stones she'd carried from the creek, mortared with dried clay, that held her cooking supplies off the ground. She'd built a raised sleeping platform from split branches lashed with rope, 6 inches off the floor, which meant the cold from the ground didn't seep up through the bedding the way it had in the first weeks. She'd found a deposit of better clay, richer, more plastic, a 1/4 mile east, and had gone back to it twice to patch the sealed walls as the first application dried and cracked. The fire, which she now maintained with the constant low attention of someone tending something that cannot be allowed to go out, had created its own history on the interior walls. A band of soot that rose from the floor to about 3 feet, then cleared above it where the natural draw of the tree's chimney pulled the smoke upward. She knew from that soot line exactly where the warmest air pooled, exactly where to position the stone for sleeping heat, exactly how high to bank the coals at night to make it through until morning. She knew this tree. She knew it the way you know a place when you've had to understand it to survive it. She'd also begun, quietly, to know the forest around it. The rabbit runs she'd mapped in her first week had expanded into a mental geography of the surrounding half-mile, where the runs concentrated, where they spread, which areas the animals used for shelter versus travel. She knew where the creek ran shallower and where it ran deep enough that even in hard cold, the surface ice might give way. She knew which deadfall was worth harvesting and which was punky, too far gone to burn with any efficiency. She knew the deer trail that ran behind the cedar to the east and the mineral lick at its end, which meant the possibility of larger game if she could manage it, though deer were a different problem than rabbits, and she was not there yet. She started teaching Elsie to read the forest the same way her father had taught her, not as lessons with a formal beginning and end, but as ongoing conversation woven into whatever they were doing. "Look at that tree," she'd say, pointing while they gathered wood. "What's different about it?" Elsie would study it with the focused scowl of someone who knows they're being tested and doesn't want to get it wrong. "The bark's looser." "Why?" "Because it's dead?" "Because it's dying, still standing, but losing moisture. In 2-3 weeks it'll be better firewood than it is now, so we remember where it is." Elsie filed this away with the same quiet efficiency she filed everything. She was, Mabel was discovering, an excellent learner in the outdoors. Attentive, persistent, not given to the boredom that might have stopped another child. Whether this was her nature or what circumstances had made of her, Mabel couldn't say. Probably both. One afternoon near the end of the 3rd week, Elsie stopped in the middle of gathering dried moss and said, without preamble, "Do you think Papa knew?" Mabel went still. "Knew what?" "That grandfather would do this. When he died, I mean. Do you think he knew what would happen to us?" She had thought about this herself, more than once, more than a dozen times. She had gone back and forth on it, whether Daniel had known, whether he'd tried to change it and failed, whether he'd simply trusted that Harold would do right by his wife and daughter, because trusting Harold had always been easier than confronting him. She didn't know. She genuinely didn't know. "I think your papa believed his father would take care of us," she said. "I think he believed that because he wanted to believe it." Elsie was quiet for a moment. "That's not the same as knowing," she said. "No," Mabel agreed. "It's not." Another silence. Elsie picked up a clump of moss and turned it in her fingers. "I'm not going to be like that," she said. "When I grow up, I'm not going to want things to be true and then decide they are." Mabel looked at her daughter, this 8-year-old girl standing in the snow between the trees, making a promise to herself about who she intended to be, and felt something expand in her chest that hurt and comforted her at the same time. "That's a good thing to decide," she said. "I know," Elsie said simply, and went back to gathering moss. The temperature dropped another 15 degrees in the 4th week, which Mabel hadn't thought she was ready for, and discovered she was approximately ready for. The extra ceiling held. The banked fire held. The raised platform made the difference between sleep and a kind of miserable wakefulness that would have exhausted her past the point of function, and she slept. Not well. Not without waking twice a night to check the coals. But enough. She'd caught 7 rabbits by then. The skins were stretched and drying on the cedar wall near the fire, each one a different shape and size depending on the animal, and she'd started the slow process of working them soft with her hands in the evenings, pressing and working the dried skin until it became pliable. It was tedious work that made her fingers ache. She did it every evening while Elsie slept by firelight, because the evenings were the only time she had for it, and because mittens were not a luxury out here, they were somewhere between necessary and critical. She thought about things in those evening hours. She thought about the woman she'd been a month ago, the woman who'd sat in Harold Thornton's parlor and listened to a lawyer read the terms of her own dispossession and said all right because she'd learned, over years of that household, to accept without fighting. She thought about whether that woman was gone or just dormant. She thought about whether what she was doing out here, all this surviving, all this building, all this cold, relentless work, was making her into someone new or uncovering someone who had always been there, underneath the years of making herself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for her. She thought it was probably the second thing. She thought her father had known it, which was why he'd taught her what he'd taught her. She thought Daniel had glimpsed it sometimes, in the early years, in the way he'd looked at her, as if she was more than he'd expected, and he was glad and slightly uncertain in equal measure. She thought Harold Thornton had feared some version of it, in his deep, unspoken, instinctive way, which was possibly why he'd worked so hard over 6 years to make sure she never had occasion to find out. It was past midnight when she finished the first mitten. She held it up by the firelight, turning it, looking at the rough seams she'd worked with thread she'd unraveled from the hem of one of Daniel's old shirts. It was not a beautiful mitten. The thumb was slightly too short, and the palm seaming was uneven on one side where she'd had to compensate for a thin patch in one of the rabbit skins. But it would keep a hand warm, she was certain of it. She set it down beside the sleeping Elsie and looked at her daughter's face in the firelight. The round cheek, the hair that was getting longer without being cut, the small particular frown she wore even in sleep, like she was working something out in her dreams. They had been here 4 weeks. They had survived 4 weeks of Montana winter in a hollow tree, with a broken axe handle she'd repaired and clay she'd carried from a frozen creek bank and rabbit snares she'd built from the rope she'd thought to pack. They had survived it because she had known things and done things and refused, at every single decision point, to accept what everyone had assumed about her. She put her hand on Elsie's hair, very lightly, not enough to wake her. Outside, the wind moved through the upper branches of the cedar, a sound she'd come to know well enough to interpret, the difference between a gust and a front, between weather that would pass and weather that was arriving with intention. This one was arriving with intention. She listened to it for a long while, rebuilt the fire slightly higher than usual, checked the clay-sealed walls for any new cracks where cold might find its way through, added an extra layer of pine boughs over the sleeping platform. Then she sat down beside the fire and she thought about what else she'd need to do to be ready. Not because she was afraid, because she had stopped confusing preparation with fear somewhere in the past 4 weeks and learned that they were different things entirely. Fear was what you felt when you believed you couldn't handle what was coming. Preparation was what you did when you decided that you could. She had decided that she could. She didn't know yet what was coming, not the specific shape of it, not the scale. She knew it would be hard. She knew the mountain's hard things and its human things were both still out there, and that neither one was finished with her. She put another piece of wood on the fire and watched the sparks go up the natural channel of the ancient cedar, spiraling up through the living wood toward the sky above the canopy. The tree breathed around her, settled, held. She was still here. She was warm. She was ready. The wind she'd heard that night was the beginning of something, though she didn't know yet how much of something it was. The next morning came in gray and heavy, the sky the color of old pewter, low enough that the mountain peaks had disappeared entirely behind it. She stood outside the cedar for a few minutes after dawn, reading the air the way her father had taught her. The pressure of it, the direction, the smell of snow in it, which was different from the smell of cold that was simply cold. Snow had a particular blankness to it, a kind of olfactory silence, like the world muffling itself in preparation. This was snow. A lot of it. She went back inside and started calculating. She had 3 weeks of food remaining if she was careful. 2 if the trapping slowed, and trapping would slow when heavy snow came because the animals went to ground and stayed there, conserving. She had a reasonable wood supply, maybe 9 days' worth of the split and stacked, plus what she could gather in the next few hours before whatever was coming arrived. The clay ceiling was holding on the walls, but there were 2 new hairline cracks near the top of the gap opening that she'd been meaning to address and hadn't. "Get dressed," she told Elsie. "Everything you have, all at once." Elsie, who had been developing a fine instinct for when questions would slow things down, got dressed without asking why. Mabel sent her out to gather kindling, the small dry stuff that started fires rather than sustained them, which she'd been letting run low because the larger split wood was the priority. She needed a buffer of both, and she needed it today. "Don't go past the second boulder," she said. "Stay in the area where you can still see the tree." "I know," Elsie said. "I mean it." I know you mean it, Elsie said, with the precise tone of an 8-year-old who is being patient with an adult's anxiety and wants credit for it. Mabel spent the morning in a focused, almost meditative state of work. She split wood until her shoulders burned and then kept going. She repatched the hairline cracks with the last of her good clay, working it in with her thumb, smoothing it flat, willing it to hold. She reorganized the food stores, pulling everything out, assessing it with clear eyes, repacking it in order of priority and caloric value, making the decisions about what could be stretched and what couldn't, with the same cold arithmetic she'd been doing since the first week. Elsie came back twice with armloads of kindling, depositing them in the dry space to the right of the fire and going out again without being asked. Each time she came back, her cheeks were redder and her breath came faster, but she didn't complain and she didn't slow down. And Mabel noted this with the part of her mind that was always watching her daughter, always taking inventory of what the girl was becoming. By midday, the first flakes arrived. Not the tentative early flakes of a moderate snowfall. These came sideways, driven, purposeful. Within an hour, the visibility outside the cedar had dropped to 20 feet. Within 2 hours, Mabel couldn't see the second boulder from the gap opening. "Stay in," she told Elsie, though the instruction was unnecessary by then. The cold coming through the gap had an edge to it that was different from regular cold, more aggressive, less patient. She sealed the gap as thoroughly as she'd ever done it. The woven branches, the clay patches, the extra piece of bark she'd kept propped against the wall for exactly this kind of situation, wedged into the bottom of the opening and clay set at the edges. She left only a gap at the top, barely the width of her fist, which she needed for air circulation. A fire in a sealed space was its own danger, and she'd never forgotten that. The sound of the storm, filtered through the cedar walls and the gap ceiling, became a low constant pressure rather than a roar. The tree moved slightly in the highest gusts. She could feel it through her back when she sat against the wall, a deep, slow sway that was not alarming exactly, but was impossible to ignore. "Is the tree going to fall?" Elsie asked. She was sitting on the sleeping platform with both blankets around her shoulders, watching Mabel with steady, dark eyes. "No," Mabel said. "It's been standing here longer than anyone alive. These roots go 30 feet in every direction. But it's moving. Trees move. That's part of how they don't break. They bend a little." She added a piece of wood to the fire. "You bend a little or you snap. That goes for trees and people both." Elsie considered this. Did grandfather snap or bend? The question surprised her. She sat back on her heels and thought about Harold Thornton, the rigid set of his jaw, the way he'd never in 6 years admitted to being wrong about anything, the way he'd handed papers to a woman in a black dress on the day of his son's funeral, without any visible flicker of doubt. "He's made of the wrong kind of wood," she said finally. "Some wood looks hard from the outside, but it doesn't flex. When the real pressure comes, it fractures along the grain." Elsie nodded slowly. "So he'll snap." "Maybe," Mabel said. "That's not our problem right now." Their problem right now was the storm, which did not stop the way afternoon snowfall stops. It came in waves, a period of relative lessening that made you think it was done, followed by another wall of wind and snow that was somehow worse than the one before it, as though the mountain were pacing itself for something sustained. By evening of the first day, the gap opening was blocked from outside by a drift that had built against the cedar's scarred face. She had to dig through it with the cooking pot to reopen the small air gap at the top, packed snow into the pot, brought it in, melted it for water. The operation took 20 minutes and left her soaked to the elbows. "Smart," Elsie said, watching her pour the meltwater into the larger pot. "Thank your grandmother's instinct about packing cooking pots," Mabel said. "She told me once, you can always carry water in a pot, but you can't always carry a pot in water." "I didn't know her." "I know. She died when you were 2. She dried her arms on the inside of her coat. She was a sensible woman, more sensible than the circumstances she lived in deserved. The second day of the storm was harder than the first. Not because the wind was worse, it was roughly the same, that relentless driving pressure, but because there was nothing to do. She'd done everything she could do to prepare, which meant that the remaining work was simply endurance, and endurance without action was harder. She'd always been better at working a problem than at sitting inside one. She inventoried, reorganized, and made small repairs to things that didn't strictly need repairing just to give her hands something to do. She finished working the second batch of rabbit skins. She retightened every lashing on the sleeping platform. She sharpened her father's knife on the flat stone she used for the purpose, working the blade in slow, careful strokes, then tested it on a piece of wood and sharpened it again. Elsie slept more than usual, which was the right instinct, conserving calories, conserving heat. When she was awake, she talked, because Elsie's response to uncertainty was to fill silence. "Tell me about when you were little," she said. Mabel was working the edge of a rabbit skin, her hands moving in the repetitive press and work motion she'd developed. "You've heard all the stories I have. Tell me one I haven't heard." She thought about it. "My father once got himself stuck up a pine tree." Elsie looked up. "Why?" "He was trying to get a look at a hawk's nest, climbed up fine, got what he needed, and then realized he'd gotten himself out far enough on a branch that coming back was going to be a problem." "What did he do?" "Sat there for 2 hours until the branch stopped being quite so bouncy, and he convinced himself he wasn't going to fall." She paused. "Then he came down, and he didn't tell my mother what had happened, and I saw the whole thing from the edge of the pasture, and I didn't tell her either." Elsie grinned. It was the first grin in 2 days, and it did something to the air in the hollow, opened it up a little. "You were his accomplice." "I was maybe 9 years old, and I thought the whole thing was hilarious, so yes." "Did he know you saw?" "He knew. He didn't say anything to me about it for 3 days, and then one morning at breakfast he said, 'You're a good keeper of unnecessary secrets,' and that was the whole conversation." Elsie was quiet for a moment. "I think I would have liked him." "He would have liked you. He liked people who thought before they talked." "I don't always do that." "No, but you're getting better at it." She set the skin down. "He taught me most of what's keeping us alive out here, and he taught it to me the same way he climbed that pine tree, by deciding to try something and then figuring out the getting back down part afterward." Outside, a gust hit the cedar hard enough that the sway was noticeable, a deep, slow lean that settled back after a few seconds. Mabel watched the fire. The draw was still good. The smoke went up clean, the natural chimney doing its work even in the storm's pressure. She thought about the tree again, about what it had survived to reach this size, how many storms, how many seasons, how many years of exactly this pressure, this cold, this relentless weight. The lightning strike that had hollowed it had not killed it. The tree had kept growing around the damage, had incorporated the wound into its structure, had become something that could shelter 2 people in the worst winter in decades. She thought there was something there, some idea about damage and continuation. She didn't turn it into a lesson she'd say out loud to Elsie. That would make it sentimental, and sentiment wasn't what either of them needed right now. But she held it quietly, in the way you hold things that are useful. The morning of the third day arrived so silently that she didn't immediately trust it. She woke before dawn as usual, and the first thing she registered was the absence of the sound she'd been hearing for 2 days, that constant low pressure of wind against the cedar's skin. The hollow was quieter than it had been since the storm began. The fire was low but still going, the coals banked red-orange in the gray pre-dawn light. She lay still and listened. Nothing. Or not nothing. The forest sounds that were underneath everything, the creak and settle of cold wood, the particular silence of deep snow, which is its own kind of sound. But no wind, no storm. She sat up carefully so as not to wake Elsie, pulled her coat on, laced her boots, and pushed through the gap. The snow was past her waist. She stood in the gap and stared at a world that had been entirely remade overnight, the trees buried to their lower branches, the landscape smoothed into curves and drifts that bore no relationship to what she knew was underneath them, the light coming from everywhere at once. The way it does after a heavy snowfall, bounced and multiplied by every surface until there are no shadows. She waded out from the cedar, pushing through the snow with her legs, feeling it pack cold against her coat and her boots. The cold was serious, the kind that meant every breath needed to be measured, every exposed inch of skin attended to. She pulled the wool wrap she'd made higher over her chin and kept moving. She went 30 feet from the cedar and stopped and looked around. The forest she'd spent 5 weeks learning was almost unrecognizable under this much snow. The paths she'd made, packed down by daily use until they were reliable footing, were gone. The smaller trees were bent double under the weight of snow on their branches, some of them bent so far they formed arches. A section of deadfall she'd been planning to harvest had been buried entirely, and she wouldn't find it without digging. She turned in a slow circle, orienting herself by the large landmarks. The biggest trees, the line of the creek, the direction of the light. Rebuilding her mental map, noting what she could see and what she'd lost, and what could be recovered with effort. Then she turned to look toward the south, toward the direction she knew the Thornton Ranch lay, and she saw it, or rather, she didn't see it. There should have been smoke. Even at this distance, on a clear morning after a storm, she should have been able to see the thin, dark line of smoke from the ranch's main house chimney rising against the white sky. Harold Thornton was many things, but he was not careless about fire. He'd kept that house's fireplaces burning through every winter she'd known him, the logs stacked in the covered wood store beside the main house in quantities that she'd once found excessive. There was no smoke. She stood very still and looked at where the smoke should have been. Nothing. The sky above the tree line in that direction was white and empty and still. Her first thought was practical. The storm had been bad enough to overwhelm the wood stores. 3 days of this cold, this wind, the ranch hands potentially unable to get to the covered store, the fires going out. It was possible. More than possible, if the storm had hit the valley harder than it had hit this higher elevation, which storms sometimes did. The low places collecting the worst of it. Her second thought was less practical, and she shoved it down hard because she didn't have time for what it carried. She went back inside. Elsie was awake, sitting up with the blankets around her, and she looked at Mabel's face and said immediately, "What happened?" "The storm's over." "You don't look like it's over." Mabel pulled her boots off and set them by the fire to warm through. "I need to go out and assess. Check the snares, figure out what the snow did to the wood supply, rebuild the main path." "What else?" Elsie said. She looked at her daughter. This child who had been watching her face for weeks and learning to read it the way Mabel read the sky and the tracks and the bark of trees. "I looked toward the ranch," she said. Elsie went still. "And?" "No smoke from their chimney." The silence in the hollow held itself carefully. "That could mean a lot of things," Elsie said finally, and Mabel recognized the tone. It was her own tone, the one she used when she was being fair to a situation she didn't want to be fair to. "It could," she said, "but it might not." "It might not." Elsie pulled her knees up under the blanket and looked at the fire. Her face was doing several things at once, working through it, the way it always worked through things, arriving at whatever she was going to decide. "If they're in trouble," she said, "what do we do?" And there it was. The question Mabel had been circling since she'd turned around and seen the empty sky. The question she'd been half expecting and had not answered for herself yet, because answering it required deciding who she was going to be, not who circumstances had made her, not who Harold Thornton's papers had told her she was, but who she was going to choose to be when the choice was entirely hers and entirely hard. Harold Thornton had put her and her 8-year-old daughter out of their home on the day they buried Daniel. He had done it efficiently, without apology, without a single moment of visible reckoning. Raymond had said nothing. Constance had looked at her hands. And Mabel had said all right, and walked out into the cold and not looked back. She had survived what he'd sent her into. She had more than survived it. And now, 5 weeks later, standing in a hollow cedar she'd sealed with her own hands and warmed with fires she'd built, and stocked with food she'd caught, she was looking at the empty sky above a ranch that had turned her out and thinking about what came next. "We go check on them," she said. Elsie looked up. Something crossed her face, complicated, unresolved. Even after what he did. Even after. Why? It was a fair question. Mabel thought about several answers. The ones that sounded like principles. The ones that sounded like wisdom. The kind of thing you'd say if you wanted it remembered later. She discarded all of them, because Elsie would recognize performance, and performance wasn't what the moment deserved. "Because I don't want to be someone who let people freeze," she said. "Whatever they did, I don't want to be that." Elsie held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the same decisive nod she'd given on the night Mabel said into the forest, when she'd picked up the cart handle. "Okay," she said. "When do we go?" "I need to check the snares first and get you fed and dressed properly. Then we go." She'd caught 2 rabbits in the snares, which were buried but functional. She'd set them up in the lower branches of bushes precisely because a snowfall would bury ground-level snares, and she'd learned this, as she'd learned most things out here, by failing at the previous version and adjusting. She cleaned the rabbits quickly, started the cooking pot with one of them and the remaining beans, and fed Elsie a full portion, fuller than usual, because the walk to the ranch was 3 miles of post-hole travel through chest-high drifts in some places, and she needed the child to have reserves. She dressed Elsie in every layer she had, wrapped her head and face until only her eyes showed, pulled the rabbit fur mittens onto her hands. She'd finished the second pair 3 days ago, slightly better than the first, the seaming more even. Then she dressed herself the same way, methodically, checking each layer, nothing exposed, nothing loose. She packed the satchel, the cooking pot, a wrapped portion of cooked rabbit, the small axe, the rope, the fire-starting kit. She thought about what she might find on the other side of this walk and packed accordingly, not for a social call, but for a situation. She looked around the hollow one time before they left. The fire banked carefully, the smoke going up clean, the walls sealed, the sleeping platform neat, the stored wood, the remaining food, the rabbit skins on the wall. All of this, built with her hands, in 5 weeks, in Montana winter. "Come on," she told Elsie. The walk was hard in ways that were hard to describe to someone who hadn't done it. Post-holing through deep snow sounds manageable until you've done it for an hour. The constant high-stepping, each foot sinking through the crust, the effort of pulling it back out, the weight of snow that packs into every step. She made the path as best she could, going first, breaking the crust. So Elsie's steps were easier behind her. Her thighs were burning inside 30 minutes. She didn't stop. The forest thinned as they moved south, the big old-growth trees giving way to younger growth, and then to the edge of the Thornton property. She knew the boundary by the fence line, which was buried but visible as a slight regularity in the snow's surface, the posts showing their tops above the white. She climbed the fence, or climbed through where the fence had been, the top wire just visible above the drift, and helped Elsie over, and they pushed on through the open pasture toward the main house. She saw it before she expected to. The pasture was more open than the forest, and the visibility stretched out, and the main house appeared maybe 400 yards away, sitting large and silent in the white. No lights, no movement, no smoke. She walked faster. Elsie kept pace without being told. The front yard was buried. The porch steps were gone under a drift that rose past the porch railing. She went around to the side where the covered wood store was, or where it had been. Part of the roof of the covered structure had collapsed under the snow load, folding inward, and the wood it had sheltered was buried under the collapsed roof and the snow that had followed it in. She stood in front of the collapsed wood store and took a full breath. So that was it. The roof had gone, the wood had been buried or soaked. The house had lost its supply. In 3 days of serious cold, without fire, a house that size became dangerous inside maybe 18 hours and deadly inside 36. She found the main house door buried to its middle. She dug through the drift with her hands and the side of the cooking pot, clearing enough to pull it open, and she and Elsie pushed inside. The cold inside the house hit her like a different animal than the cold outside. It was a trapped cold, a still cold, the cold of a space that had been sealed and left without heat. It was almost colder than outside, the way a closed refrigerator on a winter porch gets colder inside than the air around it. "Hello?" she called. Her voice went out flat and strange in the frozen rooms. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, she heard it. A sound. Low, barely there. She went toward it without stopping, through the parlor she'd sat in 6 weeks ago listening to the lawyer read papers, through the hallway, to the room at the back of the house that she knew was Harold and his wife Margaret's room. She opened the door. They were all there. Harold and Margaret in the bed, buried under every blanket in the house. Raymond on the floor with a quilt pulled over him. Constance against the wall, her arms around herself, barely moving. They'd done what people do when the heat goes, gathered in one room, pooled body heat, waited. Harold's eyes opened when she pushed the door. They stared at each other across the frozen room. He was gray-faced with cold, his lips the particular bloodless color that meant core temperature loss had begun. He was alive. He was conscious. He was looking at the woman he'd expelled from this house 5 weeks ago, who was now standing in the doorway of his bedroom, wearing rabbit fur mittens she'd made herself, and carrying a cooking pot and an axe. She didn't say anything to him yet. There wasn't time for what needed saying, and some of it might never be time for. "Elsie," she said, "start clearing snow from the kitchen fireplace. I need to see if the flue is clear." Elsie moved without hesitation, past her, through the house, toward the kitchen. Mabel went to the bed and felt Harold's hands. Cold, but not the worst she'd feared. Not the waxy, bloodless cold of something too far gone. Margaret was worse, barely responsive, her breathing shallow. Raymond stirred at the touch of Mabel's hand on his shoulder, looked up at her with the disoriented expression of someone returning from somewhere they hadn't expected to come back from. "The wood store roof collapsed," she said to him because he seemed the most coherent. "You lost your supply." Raymond blinked, stared at her. His face, in the gray light, was doing something complicated that she didn't have time to interpret. "How long have you been without heat?" she asked. "Day and a—" He swallowed. "Day and a half, maybe more." The kitchen fireplace clear? "Should be. We tried to start it yesterday. Couldn't find dry wood." She went back through the house to the kitchen, where Elsie was already clearing snow from around the hearth. Snow had gotten in somewhere, a small drift in the corner near the flue. The child was working with the cooking pot, scooping snow and dumping it in the corner, efficient and fast. "Good," Mabel said. She checked the flue, pulled the damper, looked up into the darkness, saw the faint gray light at the top, clear. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the fire-starting kit. The waxed cloth with the char cloth inside, the small tin of dry tinder she carried on her person and had kept dry through everything, the flint and steel. She needed wood, dry wood. The covered store was ruined, but the main house had an interior wood box by this fireplace that sometimes, she checked. Yes. Not much. 3 pieces of split pine, dry, stored inside and therefore sheltered from the collapse. 3 pieces would not be enough to heat the house, but 3 pieces was enough to start a fire that would get them started. She built the fire with the same methodical attention she'd given every fire for the past 5 weeks. Tinder first, the driest possible, arranged with the care of someone who has learned that there is no recovery from a failed fire start when the tinder is limited. The char cloth took the spark on the 3rd strike. She fed it, slowly, not rushing, giving the small heat time to establish itself, moving up through the tinder to the kindling she'd set above it, to the first small split of pine. The fire caught. She stayed bent over it for a full minute, watching it, not trusting it yet, feeding it carefully from the box. Elsie crouched beside her and watched with the same attention, having learned by weeks of repetition exactly what a fire looked like when it was stable versus when it was thinking about going out. "It's good," Elsie said. Not yet, 2 more minutes." 2 more minutes, and it was good. The warmth began to spread from the hearth in slow, cautious waves, the way warmth always moves in cold rooms, tentatively at first, testing, then more confidently as the stone absorbs heat and begins to radiate. She left Elsie tending it and went back to Harold's room. She helped Raymond get Margaret into the kitchen first. The older woman was barely walking, her feet numb, and Raymond was not much better but was functional. She supported Margaret's other side down the hall, feeling the woman's weight against her shoulder. And she did not think about the fact that Margaret had sat in that parlor 6 weeks ago and not said a word while the lawyer read the papers. She did not think about that because it was not useful right now. There was a woman who was dangerously cold, and there was a fire in the kitchen, and those 2 facts were the only things that mattered. She got Margaret settled as close to the hearth as was safe, helped Raymond sit beside her. Then she went back for Harold. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when she came in, had managed to get himself upright, which told her he was in better shape than Margaret, his core temperature not as depleted. He was looking at the floor. She came and stood in front of him. He raised his eyes. In 30 years of knowing this man, 6 years directly, the preceding years by Daniel's descriptions, she had never seen his face look like this. Not guilty, exactly. Harold Thornton's constitution was not built for guilt in its clean form, but something adjacent to it, something that happens to people when they've been living inside their own certainty for so long that having it removed doesn't leave enlightenment, just bewilderment. The expression of someone who'd believed the world was a particular shape and was now confronting evidence that it wasn't. She'd thought about this moment. In the evenings, in the hollow cedar, in the hours when her hands worked rabbit skins and her mind went where it wanted, she'd thought about what it would feel like to stand in front of Harold Thornton when the terms had changed. She'd imagined something with more, satisfaction maybe. A clean, righteous anger. Some version of justice that had a recognizable shape. What she felt, standing in front of him now, was mostly just tired. and determined. And something underneath both of those that was not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, maybe not ever completely, but was the refusal to let his actions define the size of what she was willing to do. She held out her hand, not to shake, to help him stand. He looked at her hand, he looked at her face. Something moved through his expression that she could not name and did not try to. He took her hand. She pulled him upright. He was heavier than she'd expected, or she was more tired than she'd thought, and she had to brace herself against it, her boots finding purchase on the frozen floor. She got him standing. He steadied himself against the doorframe. "The kitchen," she said. "There's a fire going." He nodded, didn't speak. She didn't speak either. She let go of his hand and walked ahead of him down the hall, leaving him to follow or not, and she went back to the kitchen where Elsie was feeding wood to the fire, and Margaret was showing signs of returning circulation, the pinched whiteness in her face easing by small degrees into something more recognizable. Constance was on the floor near the hearth, her back against the wall, and she was looking at Elsie with an expression Mabel had never seen on Constance's face before in 6 years. Something like disbelief. Something like a reckoning. Mabel set the cooking pot on the hook over the fire. She'd filled it with snow on the way in, and it would be water soon. She added the remaining rabbit from her satchel, the cooked meat she'd brought, and the beans that had been soaking in residual heat since morning. It wouldn't be much, but it would be hot. Harold came into the kitchen and stood against the far wall. Raymond looked at him. Neither of them said anything. The fire popped and settled. Elsie, without looking up from the fire, said, "I need more wood, or this won't last." "Where?" Raymond managed. "There might be some in the barn that stayed dry," Mabel said. She looked at Raymond. "If you're able to stand, it would help to check." Raymond stood. He was shaky and his color was wrong, but he stood, and he went toward the back door and he went to look, because apparently even in this state, being given a task was enough to make a person move. The pot began to steam. Harold watched it, watched the fire, watched Mabel's hands moving with the automatic competence of someone who has done this particular thing, this exact sequence of building a heat source from limited materials in a cold kitchen, enough times that it was no longer something she thought about. He watched her the way you watch someone do something you didn't know they could do. She didn't acknowledge the watching. She stirred the pot. She checked Margaret's hands. Better, the circulation returning in the red-white-red sequence that meant the damage was not permanent. She adjusted the flue slightly to get better draw. She sent Elsie to check the other rooms for anything else that might burn safely if Raymond didn't find enough in the barn. She worked. That was what she had. The work was the answer to everything out here, to cold and to hunger and to grief and to the complicated, unbearable thing of standing in this kitchen where she'd been a visitor and a burden and never once a person with authority, and doing now what she did every day in the hollow cedar, which was take care of what needed taking care of. Raymond came back with wood. Not much, 4 pieces, but the barn had kept them dry. He set them by the hearth, without ceremony. Mabel added one immediately and held the others. The room was warming. Not quickly. Not the comforting rush of a well-established fire in a warm house. This was the tentative, incremental warming of a space that had been cold too long. Stone walls that needed an hour of fire before they'd stop leaching the heat back out of the room. But it was warming. Margaret's eyes were fully open now. She was looking at Mabel with an expression that was different from Harold's bewilderment. It was something quieter, something more like shame, which was different. Shame knew what it had done. Shame remembered. Mabel ladled a cup of broth from the pot. Not much substance yet, just the hot liquid off the top, the beans not done, and brought it to Margaret first. The older woman took it with hands that still trembled and held it, and did not drink immediately. She just held the warmth of it. "Mabel," she said. Mabel waited. The word stopped. Margaret closed her eyes. "I should have said something. 6 weeks ago. I should have said something." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire moved. Elsie, who had come back in from the hallway, stood near the door and looked at the floor. "Yes," Mabel said. "You should have." That was all. She didn't add to it. She didn't make it smaller by accepting it too quickly or larger by refusing to accept it at all. She just let it be the true thing that it was. She went back to the pot. Harold had not moved from his place against the far wall. He was watching her still. She could feel his eyes on her back the same way she'd felt them on the morning she'd loaded the handcart, and the sensation was similar and completely different. Then, it had been the surveillance of a man watching something he'd dismissed leave. Now it was something else, something that didn't have a simple name. She turned around and looked at him directly. "The snare line needs checking tomorrow morning," she said. "I've got 2 set near the creek, north tree line. I'll be back at first light." He blinked. "You're going back tonight?" "I have a fire burning. I'm not leaving it unattended overnight." A pause. Something passed through his face. "The woodland," he said, then stopped, like the words had come out before he decided to say them. "Tomorrow," Mabel said. "We'll talk about everything tomorrow. Tonight, put wood on the fire every 2 hours and keep everyone in this room." He nodded, just nodded. Harold Thornton, who in 30 years had never simply nodded when someone told him what to do on his own property. She pulled her coat on, rewrapped her head, pulled on the rabbit fur mittens she'd made in the evenings by firelight in a hollow tree that everyone had assumed would be her grave. She looked at Elsie. "Ready?" Elsie had the satchel on. "Ready." They walked to the door. Mabel paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at the room, at Raymond sitting by the fire with his head down, at Constance against the wall, at Margaret with the cup of broth in her hands, at Harold standing alone in the corner, looking at the floor, looking at his own hands, looking at something internal that she hoped was difficult. 2 hours, she said again. "Don't let it go out." Then she and Elsie walked back out into the white. The cold received them, indifferent as always. The snow was luminous in the late afternoon light, the sky pale blue, and still in the storm's aftermath. Their tracks from earlier were visible ahead, 2 sets, one large and one small, the path she'd broken through the deep snow on the way in. She stepped back into the first foothold and started walking. Elsie fell in behind her. They walked in silence for a while, the ranch house diminishing behind them, the forest growing closer ahead. The cedar would be visible soon. She knew exactly where to look for it, the specific gap in the tree line, the silhouette of the upper branches. "Mama," Elsie said. "Yeah." Was that the right thing to do? She kept walking, thought about it honestly, the way Elsie deserved. "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in a year. I'll know better then." Elsie was quiet for a moment. "The broth would have been better with an onion," she said. Mabel felt something release in her chest. Not laughter exactly, but adjacent to it. The version of laughter that comes when you're too tired and too wrung out for the full thing. "I know," she said. "We'll work on that." The cedar appeared in the tree line ahead. Ancient, scarred, enormous. Smoke rising from somewhere above its canopy in a thin, steady line, visible against the pale sky. Their fire, still going, keeping faith with them from a mile away. She walked toward it. They got back to the cedar as the last light was leaving the sky. The fire was exactly as she'd left it, banked low but alive, the coals still orange beneath the gray ash, the hollow warm in a way that hit her in the face when she pushed through the gap, like walking into a different season. She stood inside for a moment with her eyes closed and let the warmth settle into her before she did anything else. Her legs ached from the post-holing, and her shoulders ached from helping Margaret down the hall, and her hands ached from the cold, in the way they always ached now. A deep, bone-level complaint that started around mid-morning and didn't fully ease until she'd been near the fire for an hour. Elsie went straight to the sleeping platform, sat down, and pulled off her boots with the heavy movements of a child who has used everything she had and is now running on fumes. "Feet," Mabel said. Elsie extended her feet without argument. Mabel checked them, pressed each toe, watched the color return, checked the heels and the ball, and the small toe on the left foot that had given her some concern 2 weeks ago after a wet day. Everything looked right, cold, but right. "Fine," she said, and Elsie pulled her feet back and tucked them under the blanket. Mabel built the fire back up, added the wood she'd been saving, and heated water. She made tea from the dried pine needles she'd been collecting. It wasn't real tea, nothing like real tea, but it was hot, and it had enough of something in it that her body recognized it as useful. She made 2 cups and gave one to Elsie, who drank it with the same stoic acceptance she'd developed for all of Mabel's wilderness substitutions. They didn't talk much that evening. There was too much to sit with, and both of them seemed to understand this without it needing to be said. At some point, Elsie said, "Do you think they'll be all right tonight?" "Raymond knows what to do now, and the fire was established when we left. They'll be all right." A pause. Do you think grandfather will feed it every 2 hours? Mabel thought about Harold's face in the kitchen, the unfamiliar expression on a face she'd spent 6 years reading for danger. I think tonight he will. Elsie was quiet for a moment. What's going to happen now? After winter, I mean. What happens to us? It was the question Mabel had been carrying since she'd stood in the kitchen of the Thornton main house and looked at Harold against the wall. She'd been carrying it on the walk home and carrying it while she built the fire back up, and she was carrying it still, turning it over, looking at its different faces. I don't know exactly, she said, but we're not going back to how it was. How do you mean? I mean, we're not going back to borrowing permission for everything. We're not going back to being something Harold Thornton decides the shape of. She looked at the fire. Whatever comes next, it starts from us, not from what someone else is willing to offer. Elsie processed this with the focused quiet she gave serious things. The woodland, she said, where the cedar is. That land belongs to the ranch. For now, Elsie said. Mabel looked at her daughter, 8 years old, sitting in a hollow tree in the Montana mountains with rabbit fur mittens drying on the wall, drinking pine needle tea out of a tin cup, looking at the future with the unillusioned eyes of someone who had already survived more than most children twice her age would ever need to. For now, Mabel agreed. She slept better that night than she had in 3 days. Not easily. Sleep was never easy out here, never the full unconscious dropping away that she remembered from before, but deeply enough that when she woke before dawn, she felt the difference, felt the small restoration that even approximate rest could provide. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to Elsie breathe beside her, listening to the cedars settle around them, listening to the silence outside that meant the storm's aftermath was holding, no new weather pressing in. Then she got up and started the day. She went to the ranch at first light, as she'd told Harold she would. She checked the 2 snares on the way, one empty, one with a rabbit, which she cleaned and wrapped and carried with her rather than taking it back to the cedar first. She could work out the logistics later. Right now, she needed to see the state of things at the ranch in the morning light and figure out what help they actually needed versus what they could manage. The smoke was visible from the pasture. One chimney, the kitchen one, thin but steady. She felt something release in her shoulders that she hadn't known was clenched. Raymond was the one who answered the back door. He looked better than yesterday, still drawn, still carrying the particular haggard look of someone who'd been closer to the edge than they'd ever expected to get. But his color was returning and his eyes were present. He looked at her and then at the rabbit she was carrying, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite shame, but lived in the territory between them. "Come in," he said, and then, like it cost him something, "Please." The kitchen was warmer than it had been. Not warm, not the ambient, comfortable warmth of a well-heated house, but survivable in the real sense, the sense that mattered. Harold was sitting at the kitchen table. He'd been up, she could tell. There was fresh wood on the fire and the pot had been used, water boiled, the signs of someone who had actually followed the instructions she'd left. She set the rabbit on the table without preamble. "For your pot," she said. Harold looked at it. He was a man of 62 who had run 1,200 acres for 30 years with the particular authority of someone who'd never had to explain himself to anyone, and he was sitting at his own kitchen table looking at a rabbit that his dead son's widow had carried through 3 miles of post-storm snow, and he appeared to have temporarily misplaced his vocabulary. "Margaret," she said, "how is she?" "Better," Raymond answered because Harold wasn't answering. "She slept through, warmer this morning. Her color's better." "Good. She needs to stay near the heat for at least another day. No drafts, minimal moving around." She pulled her coat off and hung it on the peg by the door, the peg she'd used for 6 years when she came to the main house, and moved to the fire. "What's your actual wood situation? What's accessible?" Raymond ran through it. The collapsed store was a loss, but the barn had a secondary stack she hadn't known about, enough for 3 or 4 days. The house's interior boxes had some remaining. There was a cord of wood stacked against the north side of the main house that had been covered by a tarp and mostly protected, though they'd need to dig down to get to it. "Then that's today's job," she said. "Get to that cord. I'll help." Raymond nodded. Harold still hadn't spoken. She glanced at him once, quickly, and went back to assessing the fire. They dug out the wood over 2 hours. Raymond and Mabel, working with shovels she found in the barn, opening a path through the snow to the north side stack, and then carrying loads of it inside. The work was hard and cold and physical and therefore fine, because physical work occupied the body and gave the mind just enough to do that it stopped circling. She had always worked better than she talked, and she suspected Raymond was the same, because they barely exchanged 10 words during those 2 hours, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Constance appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point and looked at Mabel carrying wood, and looked at the situation, and then went and put a pot of something on the fire without comment. When Mabel and Raymond came in for the final load, Constance had made a kind of porridge from what she'd found in the pantry. Thin, not particularly good, but hot and substantive, and she ladled it into bowls and set them on the table. 4 bowls. 1 for each of them, including Mabel. Nobody mentioned that. Nobody made a point of it. It was just 4 bowls on the table and 4 people sitting down, which was such a departure from every meal Mabel had ever been adjacent to in this house that she had to spend a moment ensuring her face was doing something neutral. She ate the porridge. It needed salt and something else she couldn't name but would have helped. She ate it anyway. Harold spoke during the meal, finally. Not to Mabel directly. He spoke to the table, or to the space above the table, in the voice of a man who was being precise because precision was the only mode he had left. The wood store roof. I should have had it reinforced before winter. Nobody responded immediately. Raymond looked at his bowl. Constance looked at her hands. Yes, Mabel said. You should have. Harold met her eyes. The directness of her response seemed to be what he needed. Something real to push against rather than the careful deflection he was used to receiving. He nodded once, slowly. I owe you, he said. That's a plain fact. Several things, she said, equally plainly. Raymond looked up from his bowl. Constance's hands stopped moving. Harold didn't look away. Yes, he said. Several things. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment, the fire settling in the hearth, the sound of the house adjusting to warmth after days of cold, the particular creaks and pops of warming wood and stone. We'll talk, he said. When everyone's recovered, we'll have a proper conversation. We will, Mabel agreed. She finished her porridge. I need to get back. I'll come again tomorrow. She came every day for the next week, not because they couldn't manage. By the 3rd day, Margaret was up and moving, and the house was warm, and the Thornton household was, in most practical respects, functioning again. She came because the rhythm of it had established itself, and because there were things she was watching that required her to keep watching, and because Elsie, whom she brought along, was slowly and without ceremony becoming someone who existed in this house in a different way than she'd existed in it before. Elsie brought things each visit. A rabbit from the snares. Pine needle tea she'd made herself and packed in the tin. Once, a piece of carved wood. She'd been working on it in the evenings, a small rough horse, the carving uneven and the proportions slightly off but recognizable. She set it on the kitchen table when she arrived and didn't explain it, and nobody asked. Margaret kept it. Mabel noticed it still on the table on the 4th visit, in the same spot, and Margaret was not a woman who left clutter where she didn't intend it. The conversation with Harold happened on the 5th day, after the others had cleared from the kitchen. It was late morning, and the light came through the kitchen window, the particular clear white of winter sun on deep snow, and they sat on opposite sides of the table with a silence between them that had weight but not malice, which was more than Mabel had expected and less than she'd wanted. Harold put both hands flat on the table. His hands were the hands of a man who'd worked land for 40 years, large, scarred, the knuckles swollen from decades of cold, and there was something in putting them flat like that, palm down, that looked almost like the opposite of a fist. The North Woodland, he said, the 40 acres above the creek. Daniel always said it should have been... He stopped, tried again. It should have been part of what you had. She waited. I can deed it to you. Those 40 acres. The timber rights, the water rights, the land itself. He looked at his hands. It's what I should have done in the fall, before... Another stop. Before. 40 acres. 40 acres of mountain woodland with the old-growth cedar at its heart, and the creek running through it, and the deer trail, and the mineral lick, and the rabbit run she'd mapped in her mind over 6 weeks of daily attention. 40 acres that she knew, now, better than she'd known any piece of land in her life. That's not a gift, she said carefully. That's a correction. He looked at her. Yes. I want to be clear about what we're talking about. You're not doing me a favor. You're correcting an error. Yes, he said again, and this time his voice had something under it that she recognized after a moment as the specific texture of a proud man saying something true that costs him. And the cabin, she said. The foreman's cabin. His jaw tightened slightly. Old habit. That's Raymond's, she said before he could respond. I'm not asking for the cabin. I'll build on the woodland. I just want it understood that the cabin was ours for 6 years, and you took it back the day I buried my husband, and that's part of what's being corrected here, not the cabin itself, the record of what happened. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire talked. The house settled. Understood, he said. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd expected some version of triumph, the clean, sharp satisfaction of being right when you'd been told you were wrong. What she felt was more like tiredness and more like clarity, which were both more useful and less satisfying than triumph would have been. I'll need a lawyer to make it proper, she said. Harding's in Crabtree until March. I'll send word. She nodded, started to stand. Mabel. His voice stopped her. She stayed where she was, half risen, not sitting back down. I was looking at his hands again. Daniel, he said, and then stopped, like the name was a door he'd opened into a room he hadn't been in and wasn't prepared for. She waited. He talked about you, Harold said. More than you'd think. More than I... He shook his head. He said you were the most capable person he'd ever met, and he didn't think you knew it. She stood fully, put her hands in her coat pockets. Looked at Harold Thornton, old now, diminished in some way that had nothing to do with the cold, diminished in the way that happens when the certainty you've built your whole life on reveals itself as thinner than you thought. He was right that I didn't know it, she said. I know it now. She left him sitting at the table and went to find Elsie. The weeks after that had their own particular shape. Not easier exactly, but different. The cold was still serious, and the work was still constant, and the hollow cedar was still where they slept and ate and spent their days. But the terms had shifted in ways that mattered. The deed paperwork moved slowly, as all legal paperwork moved on the frontier. The lawyer came from Crabtree in early February, a different one than Harding, a younger man named Asa Cole, who wore a good coat and asked careful questions and didn't seem surprised by any of the answers. He took Mabel's account of what was being transferred and Harold's account and the descriptions of the land boundaries that Raymond measured out on a map, and he wrote it down in the language that would become binding. Mabel sat across the table from him and answered every question clearly and without qualification, and when he read back the description of the 40 acres and the rights that went with it, she listened to every word and corrected one boundary description that was slightly off and let the rest stand. Harold signed it. Mabel signed it below his name. She rode back to the cedar that afternoon with the copy of the deed in her coat against her chest, where she'd kept the $31 in the early days. Elsie was at the hollow, tending the fire, and she looked up when Mabel came through the gap and read her face before she said anything. It's done? She asked. It's done. Elsie looked at her for a moment. Then she said, in the voice she used for things that mattered too much for theater, 40 acres. 40 acres. Elsie looked at the cedar wall, looked at the fire, looked back at Mabel. That means the tree is ours. The tree is ours. Something happened in Elsie's face that Mabel didn't try to name, something that moved through it quickly, too layered to be a single emotion. The child turned back to the fire and poked at it with the stick she used and didn't say anything for a while. Mabel sat down beside her and they watched the fire together. Papa would have been glad, Elsie said finally. Yes, Mabel said. He would have. Are you glad? She thought about that honestly. Yes, she said, and other things. But yes. News traveled the way news traveled on the frontier, through the channels that were invisible until you tried to map them, ranch to ranch, store to store, the postal riders and the seasonal travelers, and the women who visited each other in the gaps between work. She didn't know exactly when the story started moving, only that it did, and that by late February she was beginning to see the evidence of it. The first sign was a woman she didn't know who appeared at the tree line one afternoon and stood there uncertainly, too far away to speak to, looking at the cedar. Mabel went out and met her, a ranch wife from the Donnelly place 8 miles east, a woman in her 40s with the particular weathered face of someone who'd been outside for years, and the particular careful way of moving that spoke to a life of physical caution. Her name was Vera Donnelly, and she said, with the directness of women on the frontier who have learned that circumlocution costs time they don't have, "I heard what you did, wintered in the old cedar, and then went and helped the Thorntons after." "Yes," Mabel said, neither confirming a story nor qualifying it. Vera Donnelly looked at the cedar, looked at Mabel. "I told my husband. He said I was making too much of it." A pause. "I told him he was wrong." "What did he say to that?" Something moved in Vera Donnelly's face that might have been humor in a different context. "He said he'd think about it." She didn't stay long. She was on her way to the store in Crabtree and had come out of her way to see the tree, which she did, walked up to it and put her hand on the bark and stood there for a moment, not saying anything, and then thanked Mabel and went back to her horse. Mabel watched her go and thought about that. Others came after. Not many, and not all at once. This wasn't something that happened in a rush the way things in stories sometimes did. It happened in the incremental way that real things happened, one at a time, spread across the weeks. "People keep coming to see you," Elsie said. "They're coming to see the cedar," Mabel said. "No, they're not," Elsie said. "They're coming to see you. The cedar is just the reason they say." Mabel looked at her daughter. "They want to know if it's real," Elsie said. "What you did. They want to see you and decide if they believe it." "And what do they decide?" Elsie considered. "Most of them decide yes." Mabel went back to the rabbit skin she was working. "People decide what they decide," she said. "Does it bother you that they're talking about you?" She thought about it. Did it bother her? She'd spent most of her life being discussed in terms that diminished her size, her presumed limitations, the inventory of things she couldn't or wouldn't be able to do. The current discussion was different in its content, but not entirely different in its nature. People were still assigning her a shape, fitting her into a narrative they found useful. "It doesn't bother me," she said. "What they say about me isn't what I am. I know what I am. I knew it in October and I know it better now." Elsie nodded, slowly, like she was filing that away too. "I'm going to know it early," Elsie said. "What I am. I'm not going to wait until someone puts me out in the cold to find out." Mabel stopped working the skin. She looked at her daughter. This girl who had arrived at 9 years old knowing things most adults manage to avoid knowing their whole lives. "You're already ahead," she said. Elsie picked up her own piece of work. She'd been carving again. Another small animal. This one more competent than the horse, the proportions better. "I know," she said simply, and kept working. March came in with a week of hard cold that felt like winter's last argument, insisting on itself even as the light was changing, even as the days were fractionally longer and the angle of the sun through the cedar's gap hit differently in the morning. She'd learned to read these small changes in the way she'd learned everything out here, by paying attention over time, by caring about the details that didn't seem important until they were. She was at the ranch more often now. Not every day, but 3 or 4 times a week, and the visits had settled into something she wouldn't have called comfortable, but might have called functional. An arrangement between people who had a complicated history and were choosing, each of them and for their own reasons, to build something workable on top of it. Margaret had recovered fully and was more herself than she'd been. Perhaps more herself than she'd been for years, Mabel sometimes thought, watching her. There was something different in Margaret Thornton since the storm, something that had changed when she'd sat in a cold room wrapped in every blanket in the house and watched her own hands turn wrong colors. Something had rearranged. She sought Mabel out more than she used to, not dramatically. She wasn't given to drama, which was a quality Mabel had always reluctantly respected, but quietly, in the way she'd linger at the table when the others had gone, the way she'd ask questions about the cedar that were really questions about other things. One afternoon in mid-March, she said, with her back to Mabel and her hands busy with something at the counter, "I knew, when he had Harding come that day, I knew it was wrong." Mabel kept working, didn't look up. "I told myself it wasn't my business to interfere," Margaret said, "that Harold had his reasons and his rights, and I didn't understand the legal side of it." A pause. "I understood enough." The kitchen was quiet. "I'm not telling you this so you'll forgive me," Margaret said. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know that someone in this house knew it was wrong while it was happening, and said nothing." Mabel looked up at her. Margaret was still facing the counter, her shoulders carrying the particular posture of someone waiting for something to land. "I know it's not enough," Margaret said. "No," Mabel said. "It's not enough. But it's true. And truth is something." She went back to her work. "So is the fact that you said it." Margaret nodded, turned back to her counter. They didn't speak about it again, which was the right amount. Raymond was different from his father and similar to him in ways that were both expected and surprising. He was quieter than Harold, less given to declaration, more given to watching and then acting, which meant that his apologies came in the form of actions rather than statements, which Mabel found she preferred. He fixed the wood store roof himself over 3 days in early March, working in cold that would have kept a lesser man inside. He brought wood to the cedar twice without being asked, appearing in the tree line with a sledge load of split pine and leaving it stacked near the hollow before she came out. The second time, she caught him at it. She came out of the cedar gap and found him setting the last piece on the stack, his breath coming fast in the cold. He straightened and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been caught doing something he hadn't wanted to discuss. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She nodded. He nodded. He picked up the empty sledge and went back south through the trees. She looked at the wood. Solid, seasoned, split well. She picked up a piece and turned it in her hands. She put it on the stack with the others. Harold came himself, once. Just once, and she didn't know he was coming. He appeared at the tree line without warning on a clear, cold morning in the 3rd week of March, walking through the snow toward the cedar, which was visible from the pasture edge if you knew where to look. She saw him coming and didn't go to meet him, let him make his way through the trees to where she was working. She'd been splitting wood, the repaired axe handle holding, and she kept splitting while he came. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the cedar. He'd never seen it before, she realized. He'd been at his ranch for 30 years and had never gone this far into the North Woodland, which was rough terrain with no grazing value and nothing to recommend it from a ranching perspective. He was seeing it now for the first time. He looked at it for a long time. The size of it. The scar. The gap she'd sealed, visible now with its woven branches and clay, the smoke coming from above the canopy. He didn't say anything right away. She split another piece and stacked it. "Daniel used to talk about the big trees up here," he said finally, "when he was a boy. Said there were giants in the North Woodland that the loggers had missed." "He was right," Mabel said. "I never came up to see." A long pause. "Too busy, I thought. Too much else." She split another piece, set it on the stack. "He would have been glad," Harold said, "that it was this tree, that you found this one." The word surprised her enough that she looked up. Harold was still looking at the cedar, not at her, and his face was carrying something she'd never seen there in 6 years, a genuine, uncontrolled grief. Not for what he'd done to her, not yet, or not only. For his son. For the boy who'd talked about giant trees and grown into a man who'd died before he'd gotten to bring his family to see them. She let it be there. She didn't say anything to manage it, or soften it, or redirect it. She just let him have it, the way she'd had to have her own grief in the cemetery in October, and in the evenings in the hollow cedar, and in the 1,000 small moments when Daniel's absence had made itself known. After a while, Harold cleared his throat. "The 40 acres," he said. "Asa Cole's finishing the registration this week. It'll be proper by April." "Good. There's a spring on the eastern edge of the property. You probably know it." "I've seen it. It was frozen when I found it." "It runs all year, even in bad winters. My father found it when I was young. He said it was the best water on the whole ranch." Harold looked at the ground. "It should have been part of what Daniel had, what you had." She set the axe down. "Let us feel that. The specific ache of what should have been different, what could have been different if Harold had been a different man, or Daniel had stood up differently, or the world had been arranged with less cruelty and more fairness." She felt it. And then she set it alongside everything else she'd accumulated, the cracked axe handle, and the frozen clay, and the nights she'd banked the fire and lain awake calculating, and the mornings she'd gotten up anyway, and the rabbit mittens, and Elsie's hand on the cart handle saying, "Okay, let's go." "It's mine now," she said. "That's what matters." Harold looked at her finally. His face had settled back into something more recognizable, but something in it had changed permanently. Some hardness that had been structural, that she'd always read as simply who he was no longer there, or not as solid, as though the storm had found the same crack in him that she'd predicted and he'd fractured along it, and what was left was smaller and more honest. "Yes," he said, "it's yours." He left shortly after, going back through the trees, his large figure moving south toward the ranch. She watched him go, and then she picked up the axe and split 2 more pieces of wood, because the work was what was real, and the work was what continued. Elsie appeared from behind the cedar where she'd been. Mabel was fairly certain, listening to the whole exchange. "Did you know he was coming?" Elsie asked. "No." "Did it help? Him coming?" Mabel thought about that. "Something about it did. Not all of it." Elsie looked in the direction Harold had gone. "He's sad about Papa," she said. "Yes. He should have shown that before. People show things when they're ready, not when it would be most useful." She handed Elsie the smaller pieces from the stack to carry. "That's one of the harder things." Elsie took the wood. "I'm going to be faster than that," she said. "At showing things? At knowing when I should." Mabel looked at her daughter. March light in the trees, the snow beginning just barely to show the first evidence of its own exhaustion. The small south-facing slopes where the root zones of trees absorbed enough residual warmth to begin a millimeter of melt along the very edges. Not spring. The earliest possible signal of spring, the one you'd miss if you weren't watching. "Maybe you will be," she said. She thought that was probably true. She thought Elsie was going to be a great many things that no one would see coming, and that most of those things would arrive because of this winter, rather than in spite of it. "Come on," she said. "Let's get the wood inside before the light goes." They carried it in together, load by load, the cedar receiving each piece into the stack she'd built against the left wall. A stack that was now substantial and organized in the way her mind organized things. The driest at the front, the greener wood at the back to season further. The sizes graduated from kindling to medium split to the large pieces that burned long overnight. She stood back and looked at it when they were done. Months of work, months of cold and effort and small daily failures and small daily recoveries. Months of being exactly as capable as she'd always been and never quite believed. The fire in the hearth said, "Still here, still going." The cedar said, "Around and above and through all of it, I have held harder things than this, and I am still standing." She pulled Elsie in beside her, her arm around the child's shoulders, and they stood there in the warm hollow and looked at the fire together. Outside, the Montana mountains held their cold. But somewhere in the angle of the light and the faint, barely there change in the way the air smelled, she could feel the thing that was coming. Not yet, but coming. She could wait for it. She'd earned the right to wait for it, and she intended to be standing right here when it arrived. Spring didn't arrive the way people talked about it arriving. It didn't come in a single morning with warmth and birdsong and the world suddenly green. It came the way most real things came, gradually, unevenly, with setbacks and false starts that made you question whether it was coming at all. A day in late March that was almost warm, followed by 3 days of hard cold that felt like punishment for hoping. A week in early April where the snow on the south-facing slopes began to pull back from the tree roots by genuine inches, not millimeters, and then a night that froze everything solid again and left the landscape with a glassy, resentful surface that was harder to walk on than the deep snow had been. Mabel watched all of it without impatience, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel desperate for spring the way she'd sometimes felt desperate for Daniel to stand up to his father. That particular frustrated longing for something that was coming too slowly. Instead, she felt something closer to readiness, like the winter had done something to her relationship with time that she couldn't entirely explain, had taught her that endurance was not the same as waiting, that you could be fully occupied inside a long difficulty and emerge from it not depleted but recalibrated. She still slept in the cedar through April, partly because the deed wasn't finalized until the first week of that month and she wasn't building anything permanent on land that wasn't yet legally hers, and partly because she wasn't ready to leave it. She understood this about herself without judgment, that the hollow cedar had become something to her that went beyond shelter, and that leaving it before she was ready would be its own kind of loss she wasn't willing to take on without thinking it through. Elsie had no such ambivalence. "We could put the house here," she said one morning in early April, standing 15 feet south of the cedar, with her hands on her hips, surveying the ground with the authority of someone who'd been thinking about this for months. The morning light comes from that direction, and the cedar blocks the north wind, and there's flat ground right here that's naturally drained. Mabel looked at where her daughter was standing. She was right about all of it: the drainage, the light, the wind protection. Mabel had noticed all those things herself in October, the first night, though she hadn't been thinking about house placement then. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. Elsie looked at her with the expression she wore when the question had an obvious answer she wasn't sure she should say. "Since November," she admitted. "November. I had a lot of time to think in November." Mabel walked to where Elsie was standing and looked at the ground herself, looked at the cedar to the north of it, looked at the tree line to the east where the morning light came through in long, slanted bars in the early hours, the specific quality of winter light she'd watched every day for months, looked at the creek line to the west, visible now as the snow retreated, the sound of it returning to the world after months of silence under ice, that low musical moving water sound that she hadn't realized she'd missed until she heard it again. "South-facing front," she said, thinking out loud. "Root cellar first," Elsie said, "before the house, so we have somewhere to put food." Mabel looked at her 9-year-old daughter, who had apparently spent the winter months not only surviving but designing. "Root cellar first," she agreed. The deed came through on the 8th of April. Asa Cole rode out himself to deliver the final copy, which she hadn't expected. She'd thought someone would leave it at the Thornton Ranch for her to collect. He came to the cedar, tied his horse at the tree line, and walked through the new mud. The snow was retreating fast now, faster than she'd expected, and the ground under it was soft and dark and smelled of everything that had been frozen and was now released. And he handed her the document and waited while she read every word. She read every word. He didn't rush her. When she was done, she looked up at him. He was maybe 30, this lawyer, with a practical face and the manner of someone who'd seen enough of frontier life to take it without comment. "Everything in order?" he asked. "Everything in order," she said. He nodded. "You know there was some talk in Crabtree," he said. Not apologetically, just as information. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that happens when Harold Thornton does something people didn't expect him to do. Some people think he's going soft. Some people think you must have—" He paused, selecting the word. "Leverage." She folded the deed and put it inside her coat. "What do you think?" He considered that with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Harold Thornton nearly froze to death in his own house, and the person who came through the snow to help him was the woman he'd evicted 2 months prior. I think that changes a man's calculations." A pause. "Or it should, anyway." "And the ones who think I have leverage?" "They'll think what they think," he said. "People do." She looked at the cedar. The smoke from its chimney had a different quality in April air. Thinner, less necessary, the outside temperature no longer requiring the fire to work as hard. She'd been banking it lower at night. Another week, and she'd start letting it go down to coals overnight rather than keeping it built. "It's a remarkable thing," Asa Cole said, looking at the tree, "that you kept them both alive in there, you and the girl." "The tree did most of it," she said. "I just paid attention." He looked at her for a moment, like he was deciding whether to believe that or not. Then he picked up his saddlebag and went back to his horse, and she stood in the April mud with the deed against her chest and listened to the creek. She started clearing ground for the root cellar the following week, when the mud had consolidated enough to be workable. It was harder than she'd anticipated. The ground here had rocks she hadn't known about, buried by soil and decades of leaf fall, and each one had to be dug around and levered out before she could go deeper. Her back complained loudly by the 3rd day, and she took a half-day off from digging and spent it doing other work, repairing a section of the snare line, inventorying what food remained, assessing what the spring thaw had done to the clay ceiling on the cedar's north side, which had cracked more than the other sides during the freeze-thaw cycling of the past month. On that half-day off from digging, Raymond appeared at the tree line with a second shovel. She looked at him. "Thought you might be able to use another set of hands," he said. He looked at the hole she'd started. "Root cellar?" "Yes." He came and stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down into it with the assessing eye of someone who'd built things. "You've got a rock line at about 3 feet, he said. "I know. I've been working around it. If you undercut from the sides rather than trying to go straight down through it, you might find it's not as continuous as it looks. Rocks like that usually have gaps." She looked at him. "You've done this before." 3 times. First one I did like you're doing, straight down. Took twice as long and I nearly broke my back. He picked up the shovel he'd leaned against the cedar. If you'll have the help. She looked at the hole, looked at Raymond. He was not his father. She'd known that for years, had noted it as a fact without knowing what to do with it in the context of a household run entirely by his father. He was quieter, less certain of his own conclusions, the kind of man who showed you who he was through accumulated small actions rather than declarations. He'd brought wood without being asked. He'd fixed the wood store roof by himself in cold that would have excused inaction, and now he was standing here with a shovel. "I'll have the help," she said. They worked 4 days on the root cellar, she and Raymond and Elsie. When she wasn't at the makeshift lessons, Mabel had resumed. She'd been educating the child through the winter in the evenings, reading from the 2 books she'd packed and working arithmetic by firelight. And she wasn't stopping now that there was light enough to work by. Raymond was good company in the same way Mabel was good company. Not through conversation, but through the quality of attention he brought to the work and the absence of any need to fill silence. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, while they were fitting the timber frame that would support the root cellar's roof, he said without preamble, "I should have said something, that day in the parlor." She was fitting a notch joint, had her hands full, didn't look up. "Constance too," he said. "We both should have." She set the timber piece, checked the fit, picked up the next one. "My father had been talking about the cabin since Daniel got sick," Raymond said. Said the property needed to be rationalized. That's the word he used. Rationalized. He said it the way you'd say a word in a language you didn't like. I knew what he meant. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with his decisions about his own land. "Was that true?" she asked. "That you couldn't interfere?" A long pause. "No," he said. "I could have tried. I don't know if it would have changed anything, but I could have tried, and I didn't." She set the second timber, checked it. The joint was solid. Raymond had been right about undercutting the rock layer. They'd gained depth faster, and the walls were more stable. "You know what the difference is," she said, "between what you're telling me now and what your father said?" "What?" "You're not asking me to do anything with it. He needed me to say it was all right. You're just saying it because it's true." Raymond looked at her. She still wasn't looking at him. She had her hands on the timber frame, making small adjustments. "Yes," he said. "That's the difference." "All right," she said. "I hear it." They finished the root cellar on the 4th day, and she stood in it. 6 feet deep, 7 by 9 across, rock-walled, with the timber-framed entry she'd lined with the best-fitting pieces of stone she could find. And she felt the particular satisfaction of a finished thing. Not pride exactly. More like recognition. Like the work had been arguing all along that it was possible, and she'd been arguing back, and now the argument was settled. Constance came once, in mid-April, alone. She came on foot, which was a 2-mile walk from the main house, and she arrived in the afternoon looking like someone who'd made a decision before she'd fully made peace with it. She stood outside the cedar because Mabel was working outside and there was no invitation to come in. "I wanted to see it," Constance said. Her tone was the same careful, flat tone she'd always used, the one that had always read to Mabel as coldness, though she was beginning to think it might also be a kind of shyness that had never had occasion to become something else. "The tree." "Go ahead," Mabel said. Constance went to the cedar and looked at it for a long moment, put her hand on the bark the way Vera Donnelly had done in February, looked at the sealed gap, the smoke above, looked at the rabbit skins still hanging near the entry, newer ones from March, drying. "I always thought," she started. Stopped. Mabel waited. "I thought you were—" Another stop. She seemed to be having difficulty with what she'd come to say. "I thought you didn't know what you were doing, most of the time, on the ranch. I thought you were managing, getting by." She looked at her hand on the bark. "I was wrong about that." It was, Mabel understood, as close as Constance was likely to get to what the moment probably required. A woman who had spent 30 years married to Raymond Thornton in Harold Thornton's household had developed her own forms of armor, her own ways of being that left very little room for admission of error. The fact that she was here at all, saying this much, was more than Mabel had expected, and less than what the real accounting might have looked like. But Mabel thought about what she'd said to Raymond, that there was a difference between needing absolution and simply stating what was true. Constance wasn't asking for anything, she was just here. I know you were wrong, Mabel said. Not unkindly, just factually. Sit down if you want. There's still tea. Constance sat carefully on the flat stone Mabel kept near the entry as a working seat. She accepted the pine needle tea with the expression of someone determined not to make a face, and didn't make one. They sat for a while without talking. The April afternoon moved around them. The sound of the creek, the birds that had started coming back in the past week, the particular quality of light that only existed in this specific hour of early spring in mountain country, gold and clear and exhausted with the effort of finally arriving. "What will you build?" Constance asked eventually. "A house. On the south side of the tree." Constance looked at the ground Elsie had identified in early April, which Mabel had since cleared and staked. She looked at it with the appraising attention of a woman who had managed a household for decades and understood what a house site meant. "Good drainage," she said. "Yes. The cedar will block your north wind. That's why we put it there." A pause. "We," Constance repeated, noting it. "Elsie picked the spot," Mabel said. Something moved in Constance's face that she controlled quickly. "She's a capable girl," she said. "She is." Another silence, more comfortable than the first. "I'll send Raymond with lumber," Constance said finally. "When you're ready to frame. We have milled stock from last year Harold was holding for the barn extension. The barn doesn't need it now." Mabel looked at her. "Not as a debt payment," Constance said before Mabel could speak. "Or not only. Because you'll need it, and we have it, and that's a straightforward fact." Mabel held her gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to frame." Constance nodded, finished her tea, set the cup down and stood in the way of someone who'd accomplished what they came to accomplish and didn't intend to overstay. She walked back through the trees toward the ranch, and Mabel watched her go and thought that people were more complicated than their worst moments, which was not the same as saying their worst moments didn't count, but was still a true thing worth holding. Elsie came out from behind the cedar, where she had once again been listening. Mabel had stopped commenting on this. "She's not as bad as I thought," Elsie said. "She's not as simple as I thought," Mabel said. "That's different." Elsie considered this distinction seriously. "Yeah," she said. "Okay, that's better." They broke ground for the house in the first week of May, when the soil had dried enough to work properly and the nights were no longer dropping below freezing with any reliability. She'd drawn the plan herself. On paper, Asa Cole had left with the deed. A simple rectangle, not large, with a main room that combined kitchen and living space, 2 sleeping rooms, and a root cellar access built into the north wall. A porch on the south side because she'd spent a winter in a hollow tree and had strong opinions about the value of a south-facing outdoor space. Raymond brought the lumber as Constance had said he would. 3 loads on the ranch sledge, stacked and tarped. He helped set the sill plates and then stepped back and let her direct what came after. She'd watched enough building in her life to know the sequence, and what she didn't know she worked out from looking at the problem until it revealed its logic, which was how she'd learned everything practical she knew. Vera Donnelly came one afternoon with her husband, a broad, careful man named Pete, who looked at the framing progress with professional interest, and then looked at Mabel and said, "You've got your headers wrong here," in the tone of a man who'd built things and saw an error. She looked at the header in question. He was right. She hadn't accounted for the load transfer properly. "Show me," she said. He showed her. She watched carefully and asked 2 questions and then fixed it herself while he watched. And he nodded when she was done with the nod of someone who has determined that you can be taught. After that he came twice more, with different problems and different solutions, and she understood that this was his version of what Raymond's wood delivery had been. Not charity, not pity, just the practical extension of capacity from someone who had it to someone who needed it. The way things had always worked on the frontier when people were honest with themselves about what community actually meant. Other neighbors appeared over the course of May. Not all at once, not in any organized way, but in the incremental pattern she'd seen since February. One at a time, each for their own reasons, some openly curious, some pretending they'd come by coincidence. A man who asked about her snare setup and stayed to help hang a door. 2 women who brought food, actual food, flour and dried beans, and a smoked ham that made Elsie's eyes go wide, and who sat on the south-facing ground that would be the porch, and talked for an afternoon about the winter, about their own experiences, about what it had taken. She didn't perform any of it. She didn't perform gratitude or humility or the specific kind of inspiring strength that she understood people had built around her story. She just talked as she always had, plainly when she had something to say, and worked when there was work to be done, and let the reality of the situation speak for itself. Because the reality was, she had built a life in 40 acres of mountain woodland, starting from a hollow cedar and a cooking pot and $31 she'd saved in a coat lining. She'd done it in Montana winter, with an 8-year-old beside her, without permission from anyone. And now she was building a house on land that was hers, deeded and registered, and the spring was coming on full, and the creek was running clear, and the cedar stood at the north edge of her property, like it had always been standing there specifically for this. None of that was a story she'd planned. It was a series of decisions she'd made, each one in response to what was true, rather than what she'd hoped for. And the accumulation of those decisions had made something she hadn't imagined when she'd turned the cart north in December. She thought about this sometimes, in the evenings when the work stopped, about how the best things in her life had not been the things she'd been given or the things she'd planned, but the things that had required everything she had to be built from the ground up. The cedar was like that. The root cellar was like that. And Elsie, not built, not made, but the relationship between them, the specific quality of trust and directness and mutual respect that had developed in the months since December, that was like that too. That had required everything and had become something she wouldn't trade for any of the easier versions of the past year. Harold came in late May to see the house framing. He came with no warning again, the way he'd come in March, and she was beginning to understand that this was how he handled things he was uncertain about. He came before he'd fully decided what to do or say, so that the approach itself was the commitment, and there was no way to back out once he'd taken it. He walked around the framing slowly. She let him. He looked at the sill plates, the headers she'd corrected, the window rough openings she'd framed on the south wall. He looked at where the porch would be. He looked at the cedar, 15 feet north of the house site, and then back at the framing. "It's good work," he said. "It is," she agreed, without modesty, because modesty would have been a performance and she'd stopped performing for this man. He put his hands in his coat pockets, stood in the May light, older than she'd ever let herself see him before, the winter having taken something permanent from him that hadn't been there to see in December. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what Daniel said, about you being the most capable person he'd ever met." She waited. "I spent 6 years on the same property as you," Harold said, "and I never once asked what you were capable of. I decided before I looked." He looked at his boots. "I've done that with a lot of things. Decided before I looked." She thought about several responses. Let them all pass. "The difference between deciding before you look and looking," she said, "is what you lose in the meantime." Harold was quiet. "You lost 6 years of knowing what your son saw in me," she said. "That's not mine to give back to you. That's just gone." He nodded. Once. The same slow nod as in the kitchen in January, the nod of a man in unfamiliar territory who has decided the best he can do is acknowledge where he is. "Yes," he said, "that's gone." They stood for a moment in the May light, on either side of that truth. "Elsie," he said then, "she'll need schooling, proper schooling. She's been schooled all winter. More than you can give her alone. Not a challenge, just a fact. There's a school starting in Crabtree this fall. Real teacher, from Billings. I've agreed to help fund it," he paused, "with others. It wasn't just me." She looked at him. This was not what she'd expected, and she'd learned by now that Harold Thornton could still surprise her in directions she didn't anticipate. "You did that for Elsie," she said. "I did that for the children in this valley," he said carefully. "Elsie will benefit, so will others." He met her eyes. "I'm not trying to buy anything. I know I can't." "I know you can't either," she said. A long pause. The creek. The birds. The May sound of a world that had decided to live again after months of uncertainty. "She can start in September," he said. "She'll be ready," Mabel said. And then, because it was true, and because she'd decided to say true things even when they cost her something, "Thank you." Harold nodded and walked back through the trees toward the ranch, and she watched him go and thought that the space between who someone was and who they were trying to become was sometimes very small and sometimes enormous and almost never fixed. The house went up through June and into July in the way that frontier building went up. Not quickly, not without problems, not without the specific frustration of discovering that what you'd planned on paper and what the materials and terrain allowed were not always the same thing. The east sleeping room had to be shortened by 2 feet because of a buried rock she found during floor preparation. The chimney drew poorly the first time she built a fire in it, and she spent 3 days diagnosing the problem before she found it in the cap design, which she rebuilt twice before it worked. Elsie was with her for all of it, not always helping but always present, watching the process with the same focused attention she'd given every skill Mabel had taught her through the winter. She asked better questions now, more specific, more targeted, the questions of someone building their own mental model rather than simply trying to satisfy curiosity. "Why does the chimney cap matter so much?" she asked, on the day Mabel climbed up to rebuild it the second time. "Because if the draft goes wrong, the fire works against you instead of for you. The smoke comes in instead of going out. So the design of the top affects what happens at the bottom." Yes, Elsie thought about this. That's true about a lot of things. Mabel looked down at her from the roof. It is. Like how grandfather's decisions at the top changed what happened to us at the bottom. She hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms, but she looked at the chimney cap in her hands and considered it. "Yes," she said. "Though the difference is a chimney cap can be redesigned. So can decisions," Elsie said, "if you catch them early enough." Mabel looked at her daughter for a long moment. 9 years old. Standing in July sun with her arms crossed and her hair growing long, and a look on her face that was entirely her own. Not Mabel's, not Daniel's, not the reflection of anything she'd been told to be. Something that had been forming all winter in the cold and the work and the difficulty, and had arrived at something worth looking at. "Yes," Mabel said, "if you could catch them early enough." She climbed back up and set the new cap, and it worked the first time she lit the fire. The house was finished enough to move into by the end of July. Not finished in the sense of complete. There was interior work still to do, trim and shelving and the second sleeping room door she hadn't hung yet, but finished in the sense of livable, of sound, of a roof and walls and floors and a hearth that worked and a root cellar stocked with what she'd put by since spring. The night she moved in, moved their things from the hollow cedar into the house, a process that took one afternoon and felt both straightforward and enormous. She went back out in the evening and stood in front of the cedar one last time before dark. She put her hand on the bark. It was warm from the day's sun on its south face, the old rough cedar warm in a way that had nothing to do with fire. She stood there with her hand on it and felt the particular weight of what had happened between October and July, what had been taken from her, and what she'd built from the taking, what she'd found out about herself in a winter that had been designed by other people's cruelty and rewritten by her own refusal to accept what it was supposed to mean. She thought about what it cost to discover yourself. Not in the romantic sense of the phrase, not the version that implied the discovery was primarily pleasant, or that it arrived cleanly, or that you came out of it wholly healed of everything that had hurt you. The real version. The version where you find out what you're made of because circumstances strip away every other option, where the discovery is also grief and exhaustion, and the accumulated weight of months of cold and uncertainty, and where what you find is not a perfect self, but simply a true one. She was not done grieving Daniel. She suspected she wouldn't be for a long time, and she'd made a kind of peace with that, with carrying him in the complicated way that real people carry real losses, not as a shrine and not as a wound, but as a presence that had shaped her and was gone and left both things at once. She was not done with Harold Thornton, in the sense that they would continue to exist in proximity and the ledger between them would never be fully settled. She'd accepted that too. Some debts don't get paid in full. Some of them just get acknowledged and carried into whatever comes next. And what came next? She could see it, standing in the July evening with her hand on the cedar. The house behind her, the root cellar full, the 40 acres of woodland that were hers and were known to her in every path and creek bend and tree. Elsie starting school in September, the child's particular fierce intelligence going out into a wider world than this hollow could contain. The garden she'd plant in the spring in the south-facing ground beside the house, the one Elsie had already drawn a plan for, the plan including a variety of things that may or may not actually grow at this elevation, but which Elsie had decided to attempt on the grounds that you didn't know until you tried. The visitors who kept coming, not as many as in the spring but steadily, people who came to see the cedar, or to ask about the winter, or to ask about the clay ceiling, or the snare lines, or the chimney design, and who left with something she hadn't set out to give them, which was the specific kind of encouragement that comes not from being told something is possible, but from seeing it done. She hadn't set out to be that for anyone. She'd set out to survive December. Everything after that had been this consequence of surviving December, which was another way of saying that most of what mattered in her life had come from the decision she'd made at the fork in the road, south toward Crabtree or north into the trees, and the fact that she'd known herself well enough, or been desperate enough, or been her father's daughter enough to go north. She took her hand off the cedar bark. Inside the house, she could hear Elsie moving around, the sound of her daughter arranging her things in the smaller of the two sleeping rooms, opening and closing the new door on its new hinges, trying the window Mabel had cut on the east wall that looked out toward the morning. The sounds of a child establishing herself in a space and finding that it fits. She stood outside one more minute in the July evening, looking at the cedar, looking at the smoke that wasn't there anymore because no fire burned in it tonight, looking at the ancient scar where the lightning had struck and the tree had survived and grown around the damage and become something that could shelter two people through the worst winter in decades. The tree had not been improved by the lightning. It had been damaged, and it had continued, and the continuation was not redemption in any tidy sense. It was just life, which was always choosing to go on in spite of everything, because that was the only direction it knew. She turned and walked toward her house. The door was good. She'd hung it herself on the third try, and the third try had been right. It sat level in the frame, opened and closed clean, the latch caught on the first try every time. She'd been disproportionately pleased by this, which was how she knew she was still herself. She opened the door and went inside and closed it behind her, and the sound of it closing was the sound of a home being entered at the end of a long and particular day. And she stood in her own kitchen and looked at the hearth and the table and the one window on the south wall that caught the last of the evening light, and she let herself feel the full weight of what this was. Not perfect. Not easy. Not what she'd had before or what she'd imagined she might have. But hers. Built from the ground up, with her own hands, on her own land, after a winter that had been designed to end her. "Mama," Elsie called from the back room, "come see where I put everything." She hung her coat on the peg she'd installed inside the door, the same motion she'd made 1,000 times at the Thornton main house, but a different peg in a different doorway, in a house she'd built herself.